All right. It's Elvis time again, baby. It's summertime again, baby. Oof. Welcome back to what I have chosen to call a history of rock and roll in film and rock and roll. You may call it what you like. I'm going to make up for a little bit of what might have been neglect on the last episode. Not intentional neglect, of course, but I had a lot about Elvis to talk about and a lot less to talk about when it came to the movie that I have been focusing on. And I didn't want you to think I haven't been doing all kinds of due diligence. Honestly, there's not a ton of online reviews of this movie from people that love John Carpenter for his work in movies, in retrospectives and things like that you find online and videos and interviews. He doesn't do a ton of interviews anyways. People don't want to talk about this movie. They want to talk about Big Trouble in Little China and Halloween and all the other amazing stuff that was a little more genre defining for him. Things like They Live. But I did find a book titled John Carpenter. It was written by Colin Odell, and it has a nice little synopsis of the movie and some information about what was going on at the time with Carpenter. So, hey, why don't I pull a little info from that? It lists the cast: Kurt Russell as Elvis, Shelley Winters as Gladys Presley, Bing Russell as Vernon Presley, Susan Hubley as Priscilla Presley, Pat Hingle as Colonel Tom Parker, and Charles Cyphers as Sam Phillips. Las Vegas, 1969. It's do or die for Elvis, who is due to appear on stage for the first time in almost a decade. With rumors of an assassination attempt surrounding the appearance, Elvis works up the courage to face his audience. That's basically the beginning of the film. Mississippi, 1945. Loner Elvis is bullied by a local ruffian for talking to his dead twin, Jesse Garin, and being a mama's boy. Years later, he's still being bullied, this time for his ridiculous quiff. A friend convinces him to enter the school talent show, and his performance is enormously popular. Snapped up by Sam Phillips of Sun Studios after recording a song for his mother, his crooning becomes successful on local radio, and entrepreneur Colonel Tom Parker becomes his manager, pushing him to stardom. As the hits keep coming, Elvis buys Graceland for his mother before starting national service. During his stint with the Army, she dies. And he meets a new love, schoolgirl Priscilla Presley. They marry and have a daughter, Lisa Marie, but Priscilla becomes increasingly frustrated living with a house full of his friends, and his long absences while on tour take their toll. Eventually, she and Lisa Marie leave him. Meanwhile, Elvis needs to feel those people one more time and approaches Vegas for a triumphant tour. One of the great actor-director teams file alongside Oliver Reed and Ken Russell, Robert De Niro and Martin Scorsese, John Wayne and John Ford, began with Elvis. Kurt Russell had already had a connection with the King when, in an uncredited role at the age of 10, and we talked about this last time, or not last time, but 2 episodes ago we talked about this, he delivered a sound kicking to Elvis's shins in It Happened at the World's Fair in 1963. Little did he know that he would then go on later to play Elvis himself. Carpenter and Russell got on extremely well during the shoot, and the resulting film was a smash. When it was transmitted in February 1979, Elvis became the highest-rated TV movie ever screened at that time. Told predominantly in flashback, Elvis wisely bookends the story of his life with his 1969 Vegas comeback tour and therefore doesn't fall into the murky territory of self-parody. No, listeners, you and I will get into that later in this episode, because we're going to jump back into some of that Memphis Mafia book, as well as Peter Gralnick's accounts of what was going down during the self-parody era. Though again, not out of maliciousness on my part. I'm not here to tear down anything you like intentionally. I'm just too interested in the facts as they are and as they have been recorded, or what we know to be enough factual evidence to support these stories. This book also mentions, it avoids the obesity and the drug use that plagued his last few years. It ends on a high and provides an opportunity to play out a number of hit songs. The Elvis portrayed is the one that fans remember and makes for compelling viewing. It doesn't gloss over the more contentious aspects of his life, which are occasionally sordid, but means that we are treated to a balanced portrayal of the man and the myth without being either reverential or salacious. We see, like this podcast. We see Elvis fighting, shooting his television, hiring and firing his friends and colleagues, throwing tantrums, and eventually causing his wife and daughter to leave him. For every act of philanthropy, giving lavish gifts to all and sundry, there is an act of petty spite or rejection. As much as he needs to hear the cheer of the crowd, he hates the fame. Shoot, I can't even go to church. He remains a child at heart, and what really lifts him from the straight biopic, lifts the film, pardon me, from the straight biopic, is the disturbing, almost Oedipal relationship he has with his mother. These scenes are uncomfortably intimate, and she dominates these moments as she dominates her son. He even changes his hair color to match hers and declares, "You're prettier than Marilyn Monroe." When freed of the burden of a living mother, he can finally seek a relationship. Throughout the film, the on-screen events coordinate with both the visual elements and the soundtrack. Elvis lives in the shadow of his dead twin, Jesse, so when we view Elvis alone, he talks to his life-sized shadow, a representation of his brother. Similarly, the purchase of Graceland would generally be viewed as triumphal, but instead the soundtrack plays, with some irony, "I Feel So Lonely I Could Die" from Heartbreak Hotel, and his return home is accompanied by "Are You Lonesome Tonight?" Comparisons with Steve Rash's The Buddy Holly Story from 1978 are inevitable. Both are well-made and fascinating movies about the rags-to-riches story of a rock and roll white kid, although Elvis remains the more intellectually challenging. Both have exemplary central performances. Kurt Russell is Elvis the same way Gary Busey is Buddy Holly. In later films, Russell would consolidate his A-list status by becoming a star, effectively playing Kurt Russell in Kurt Russell roles. But here he is the king. His mannerisms, the sneer, the wiggles, and the thank you very much are perfect. Although his singing voice was provided by Elvis impersonator Ronnie McDowell, Kurt Russell's father, Bing, played Elvis's father, and Susan Hubley, then Kurt's wife, played Priscilla. John Carpenter had met Adrienne Barbeau during the shooting of Someone's Watching Me, which was the movie he made for TV right before this. The pair married in 1979. They set up their own company, High White Bread Productions. But despite a number of ideas for projects, nothing concrete materialized, and Carpenter teamed up again with Deborah Hill to make another horror picture, again with a new twist on the genre. Carpenter and Hill drove the length of California to find the right location and discovered that iconic lighthouse in Inverness, just up the road from Bodega Bay, which is what leads the book into the next chapter, The Fog, 1979. There you go. Scholarly activities for the episode, for the third and I believe final episode of Elvis, until I watch other Elvis stuff. I'm not going to watch Elvis movies that starred Elvis and do reviews of them. There's a big budget new Elvis movie that's out right now. I'm hot or cold on it. I may see it someday. If I see it someday and I decide it's something that I need to cover, I absolutely will. But I don't feel like movies like that need my support or promotion or any insight from me necessarily, because they're widely available to the public and the public is seeing them now. Like for the Beatles episode I did cover the movie yesterday. I was focusing on Backbeat primarily because I really wanted to talk about that and the history of it and the musicians getting together to make it. But I had happened to have just seen yesterday, so I just kind of tossed it in there. Now, as far as my attention to the movie on the last episode, I got to a certain point and I was like, this is long enough now. It's time to put it out. It was just time to get it done and get it out there before the end of the month. I think I put 2 sections in there where I discussed it. And I have more notes about it that I wrote as I watched it along. Now, I did say in the first episode, I believe, that I have the commentary track as well as the regular audio video from the DVD. But I didn't watch the movie with the commentary track. It's recorded by a relative of Elvis Presley and the gentleman that sang his vocal parts on the soundtrack. So they're both very nice. They're both very deferential, and they're just praising Elvis all the time, right? I decided to bail after like the first 20 minutes of that because I figured I was going to just hear things that I was already getting from the 7 different books that I'm drawing from. Neither of the people on the commentary track are the filmmaker, John Carpenter. And that neither of them are involved in the shooting of the film in any way. So the nice man that sang Elvis's voice in that is a nice, polite, talented fellow, and more power to him. I'm not really going to quote him throughout this, but I touched on the bathroom fight scene in the last episode that I dragged into a comparison to Corey Feldman. You're welcome. And I wanted to read more of my notes about, what I noticed as I was watching this, with no agenda, not being a huge Elvis fan as much as I am a fan of rock and roll, but what I noticed in how it portrays him and how it wants the audience to receive the story of Elvis. As we mentioned later in this episode, and maybe have mentioned, I think, at least once before, there was a couple of books by this point, or a couple of stories and some expose type interviews and things about some weird Elvis goings on and some weird behaviors and things. So this was an attempt to give something to the mainstream public that wanted to remember Elvis in a simpler way, in a more complimentary way. But it does give the audience a couple of little clues. It's kind of heavy-handed in a couple of places about his erratic behavior, but only for like 30 seconds, and then it moves on to other things. So, and they don't link it to anything. They don't give you an indication as to why this is happening, because they're trying to downplay the drug effect, and they're not aware of other medical effects that need to be understood to understand Elvis's behavior. And I think we will probably talk about that towards the end of this episode, because I've discovered a couple things that were kind of a bombshell to me. I'm sure if you're a hardcore Elvis fan, you probably already know about them, but they weren't uncovered, these facts and these details, until fairly recently in the timeline. So I noted after the bathroom confrontation, I said, very cool that he doesn't say anything, during that. He doesn't he's not trying to verbally defend himself, say, hey man, you guys are a bunch of squares and I rule. He's too self-involved, and he's too isolated to think that he has to, talk his way out of this. He just acts. He just takes action and defends himself barely. He gets out of it. Then cut to him singing "Good Rockin' Tonight" in front of school, and a cluster of blondes just can't stop themselves from getting close and giggling in front of him. Then cut to Elvis at a dinner table talking to his mom and dad. In all scene changes since we last saw him as a child, he has spoken no lines to anyone. He's gone from speaking to mama as a little boy to speaking to mama as a high schooler and a grown man. Then pretty soon there's a sort of current day, what we're calling current day, soon before he died, and he's in Las Vegas. There's paranoia about Lee Harvey Oswald wanting to be the man who killed Elvis Presley. I didn't see much of this mentioned actually in the text that I looked up, but just in one of the books, it did say that he and Priscilla spent all weekend watching the news after JFK was killed. They stayed at home. They didn't go out. They just watched the television news reports. A lot of his erratic behavior would clearly be explainable by the fact that he and his Memphis Mafia, towards the end, but established for a while, were taking Dexedrine to stay awake and then Valiums at night to sleep. Legalized amphetamines like this would factor into the similarly violent behavior of Johnny Cash and Jerry Lee Lewis. The voice of Elvis singing is definitely an older man singing like a teenager, and not convincingly. I remember when I saw the Beach Boys at a baseball field here in Seattle, Washington, because I was dating somebody very nice who worked for Children's Hospital, and it was an employee night. It wasn't even a public concert. It was like a private engagement, which was surreal to see a Beach Boys concert for just a private crowd of people that weren't necessarily there because they were music fans. They just all worked at this Children's Hospital. But it was a big deal. And it was very strange seeing these old men in their like 70s. And obviously most of them weren't actual Beach Boys. Like one and a half of them were men in their 70s and at their youngest, their 60s, probably, stretching their faces back and tightening their vocal cords to sing like teenagers. It was bizarre. I'm so glad Johnny Cash aged the way he did. And his voice got older and shakier like an old man's voice should. Another great example. Roy Orbison. Damn it. So good. So good to the end. And let's see. The movie. Oh, then I wrote, this movie is an attempt to give Elvis all his own expository dialogue. And then I wrote, people all react to him like he's the greatest thing ever, or they want him destroyed. John Carpenter and Dick Clark are taking this opportunity not just to comfort a saddened fan base and head off scandal from tainting the memory of Elvis, unsuccessfully if my childhood was any indication, I wrote in parentheses, but also to show Elvis's influences were black American musicians who played the blues. My next note was, Pat Engel is Colonel Tom Parker. I remember him fondly as being the one to play Judge Fenton in the Clint Eastwood film Hang 'em High, and he would go on to play Commissioner Gordon in the first few Batman film adaptations, the live-action ones. I also write, the film points to a lot of Mama's Boy stuff. I then wrote, Carpenter brings in the dark string sounds right when Elvis comforts his mother and tells her that she's prettier than Marilyn Monroe. Then I went back and wrote, not in parentheses. It's not John Carpenter. I looked it up. There's a change in the tone that is very haunting in the soundtrack, and I love it. And it wasn't John Carpenter's composition. I've forgotten who it was by now, but I was just shocked that John Carpenter got like an orchestra to do this. I wonder if it was just another composer that had the recording and sold it to Dick Clark for this production. But it's a very creepy moment. So they're not, Carpenter doesn't, and Dick Clark aren't shying away from the weirdness. They're just not making it all about the weirdness. And this is the scene in the movie where that his mother makes the direct implication or the direct statement that Elvis had the power of two men because his twin had died in vitro. Then they show him buying his mom a house, which is a trope that we see in movies like La Bamba. I mean, various stories of young rock and roll, stars that want to take care of their moms and buy them a house. I think Chuck Berry did the same. And then I wrote, 90 minutes in, I realized this is predominantly a story about Elvis and his parents. Later, he meets Priscilla, and we're back to people telling Elvis how great he is, goes on with the drama of his personal life, still tons of songs, but no real talk about the writing or the recording or why he chose the songs he did. Of course, Elvis didn't write his own songs. He's one of those guys. He's the only guy in my Kings of Rock and Roll, Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Jerry Lee Lewis, Elvis, and Lemmy Kilmister that didn't write any of his own songs. I think my final note is towards the end. Watching him rehearse with his full band in his living room, 1969, they're working on Suspicious Minds. I wrote, was this just John Carpenter's own gear? Haha, no, it turns out PV was making PA heads and power amps by then, so that's what it must have been. So what set me off on that little jag was I see the band and the bass player is playing through a PV head and a cabinet, or it might have been any sort of speaker cabinet made by anybody. I don't remember if there's a logo on it. There's 15-inch speakers in it, like a bass cabinet would have, but the head on top that's powering it has a PV logo. And I'm like, that's not period specific, is it? Like, maybe John Carpenter's band just brought their gear to the set and they filmed it, like the 1979 version of equipment, and they hope no one would notice. And I was wrong. I looked it up. I looked at the history of PV, electric instruments and amplification. They had been making public address systems at that time in the 60s, PA heads, power amps, and things. And bass players would be happy to use their high wattage power amps for their own sound to plug into, instead of plugging in a microphone and then plugging that head into a speaker and then, reading off announcements in the gym that day or whatever you're doing at a high school or something, or an outdoor event for a festival or something. Anyhow, it was interesting to see that the PV logo, the pointy 80s looking PV logo, had been the same since the 60s. Hartley Peavy had drawn it on his notebook in school, I guess, and it has never changed. And I realized that, I don't know, 90 out of 100 of you were not entertained by any of that and have no clue what I'm talking about. But that 10%, that was for you. Let's talk about a little tour of the South. Around the time of the fourth single released on Sun Records, Baby Let's Play House. This tour begins in May of that year, whatever year it was. I'm not looking it up. New Orleans. The day after the single was released. Billed as a 3-week 20-city tour that employs 31 different artists, some of whom will just pick up and leave at various points. Headliners include Hank Snow, Slim Whitman, and the Carter Sisters with Mother Maybelle. Martha Carson, Farron Young, and then in a solution the Colonel devised to prevent the kind of thing that had happened on the last tour, there would be a first half of younger talent, including Jimmy Rogers Snow, the Davis Sisters, and the Wilburn Brothers, with one of the newest, though most exciting personalities in the hillbilly field, whose singing style is completely different from any other singer in the field. Elvis Presley, coming on to entertain the crowd just before an intermission. At this time, there were riots or near riots almost everywhere they played. Johnny Rivers sees the show in Baton Rouge and decides, I want to be like that guy. When they're in Mobile, Alabama, Jimmy Rogers Snow remembered Elvis being chased across a football field. There are girls in every city looking for Elvis and looking to keep him company, and he supposedly obliges, evidently. Cruises around town in the pink and white Cadillac he had just acquired to replace his Lincoln. In this case, just like the Lincoln, he had his name painted in black on the door. Jimmy Snow rooms with him on this tour, and Jimmy says he would run with the women. He'd run 2 or 3 of them in one night. Whether or not he was actually making love to all 3, I don't know, because he was kind of private in that sense. If I thought he was going to run some women in the room with him, I didn't stay. But I just think he wanted them around. It was a sense of insecurity, I guess, because I don't think he was a user. He just loved women, and I think they knew that. Every night on this tour, he calls his mom and dad at their new home in Lamar, just to let them know how he's doing, how the shows are going, finding out how they're holding up. Now, there's a girl in his life named Dixie, and she's there by the phone when he calls his parents. And of course, Elvis likes this because it saves him from having to call her separately. And it just lets him know that she's being watched over by his folks while he's out there fooling around. And Dixie herself is quoted as saying he didn't want to relinquish that control. Regardless of how long he was gone or what he was doing, he wanted to know that I was still going to be sitting there. If I wasn't there, he would ask his parents, was Dixie there? Or have you heard from her? Has she been over? Did she spend the night? I think he expected his parents to kind of keep me there while he was gone so I wouldn't do anything else. But it just got to be harder and harder after a while. He wants to know how they liked the new house. They were still renting at this time, but it was the first time since they had moved to Memphis that they had had a real home of their own. How's Daddy feeling? Was his back any better? He would reassure his mother Gladys she didn't have to worry, that he was doing just fine. He knew it bothered her the way the audiences were acting at his shows when she would see, or read about reactions. They weren't going to hurt him any. Yes, they were taking good care of his new Cadillac for him. Wasn't it the prettiest thing? No, they were being careful. He didn't know if he'd ever let Bill drive this one. And how was the pretty little pink and white Crown Victoria that he had bought for them? It was the first new car they had ever owned. He would reassure his mother that, he was always safe and he was happy and doing fine and he was still her boy. Some part of her would fear what was about to happen at any given moment. Some part of her would fear she was, seeing something terrible happening to him, to her boy. I know she worshipped him, said Dixie, and he did her, to the point where she would almost be jealous of anything else that took his time. I think she really had trouble accepting him as his popularity grew. It grew hard for her to let everybody have him. I had the same feelings. He did not belong to us anymore. Now, when the tour gets around Florida, Elvis meets Mae Boren Axton. She is a publicist. She meets up with the crew on the tour at their first date in Florida, Daytona Beach. She's a 40-year-old English teacher at Paxton High School in Jacksonville, where her husband is the football coach. She'd gotten into country music through the back door, as Peter Guralnick says, when she was asked by Life Today, a magazine for which she did occasional freelance work, to write an article on hillbilly music. Though she'd been born in Fort Worth, Texas, if you're a Pantera fan. If you're not, in Fort Worth, Texas. She grew up in Oklahoma, and her brother David became a U.S. Senator from Oklahoma. She claimed to have no idea what hillbilly music was. We listened to the opera, and my teacher taught me classical and folk songs I knew, but the term hillbilly was foreign to me, she said. She decided to research it a bit, and she went to Nashville and met Minnie Pearl. And Minnie introduces her to an associate of hers as a songwriter, which I don't know that she said she was. The book doesn't tell me. This is the Peter Guralnick book, Last Train to Memphis, The Rise of Elvis Presley. And this publishing executive named Fred Rose takes her on and says, basically, he needs a novelty song for a recording session that very afternoon. And she wrote one, just rising to the challenge of Minnie Pearl, throwing her into into the deep end, as it were. So she starts writing more songs. She gets a number of them recorded, and she keeps writing stories for fan club magazines, apparently. She hooks up with the Colonel in 1953 on a Hank Snow tour and starts doing advance press for the Colonel and his various, promotions in the Jacksonville, Orlando, Daytona area. She was attractive and feisty, apparently. Mae claimed to be the only person that she knew to ever get an apology out of the Colonel. Ordinarily, his only response to any criticism was, "The Colonel is the boss." "You be the boss," she said angrily when he tried this line on her. "Be the big wheel, but don't ever ask me to do another thing for you," which is what led to him apologizing to her. After that, she always got on well with the Colonel, and then for a while served as Hank Snow's personal publicist. She was known to be an energetic woman and resourceful, and an excellent public relations representative on a management team that left nothing to chance. Exactly the kind of person you want with Elvis Presley at this time. So the fellas are scheduled to play Daytona Beach May 7. Mae meets up with them at the motel. She says, "I had gotten up real early and gone and done an interview about the show that night and about Elvis. And I came back around 11, and the back of the motel was facing the ocean. The little rails were up there, the little iron rails, and I walked out of the door. My room was right near Elvis's, and Elvis was leaning over, looking at the ocean. Of course, there were a lot of people on the beach, and I said, 'Hi, honey, how are you doing?' And he looked up and said, 'Fine.' He said, 'Ms. Axton, look at that ocean.' Of course, I had seen it a million times. He's a traveler. She's not. She lives there. So he said, 'I can't believe that it's so big.' It just overwhelmed him. He said, I'd give anything in the world to find enough money to bring my mother and daddy down here to see it. And she says, that just went through my heart. Because I looked down there, and here were all these other kids, different show members for the night, all the guys looking for cute little girls. But his priority was doing something for his mother and daddy. In the interview, he persisted in calling her Ms. Axton. And she suggested that he just make it May. That makes it better. Elvis. She said, and I can't tell you how much I love this next sentence. She said, you are sort of a bebop artist more than anything else, aren't you? Is that what they call you? No. I mean, speaking as your narrator, not as an Elvis Presley surrogate. No, there's nothing at all bebop about Elvis Presley's music. There was a term called Western bop that emerged after Western swing. And that's as close. And I'm not a guy that knew that until about a year and a half ago with the books I've been reading. Western bop was a new thing to me. I've known about Western swing because Bob Willis and his Western Playboys and things like that. I mean, since I learned more about the beginning of rock and roll back in the 90s and stuff, but like calling Elvis a bebop musician is totally bonkers. But it reminds me, now I set this book down because I'm tired of holding it up in front of the microphone while I talk. It reminds me when I bought that Led Zeppelin like 3-disc DVD set called How the West Was Won. God, I wish I had that now. I have no idea where that is. And there's footage in the bonus features of that in 72 or 73. I'm thinking it was Houses of the Holy tour or Led Zeppelin 4 tour, somewhere around that in America. And don't call me on the phone and threaten to kill my parents if I'm wrong. But you know, the basic bitch press are asking Robert Plant and Jimmy Page questions about themselves, and the guys are I mean, it's so hard for them to deal with it. I mean, not a bad day's work still, but people are asking questions like, what would you say makes your music any different than, let's say, the music of a band like the Beatles? And you see Robert Plant just duck his face down for a second. Like, he doesn't do it comically. It's just very sort of subtle, and he sort of like swoops his head down to the left to look at Jimmy Page for half a second and then regain his composure and then get on the microphone. Well, I would say that, there's quite a bit of difference between what we do and what the Beatles do. And, Anyway, in response to this, Elvis says, well, I never have given myself a name, but a lot of the disc jockeys call me Bopping Hillbilly and Bebop. I don't know what else. Now, I mean, if you don't know, bebop is a jazz term predominantly. It's Charlie Parker, it's John Coltrane, Thelonious Monk, it's Miles Davis. It's very mind-expanding jazz generally, with a small combo, like not the Louis Armstrong kind of pleasing, large ensemble melodic stuff with a catchy vocal hook. It's a lot of, bebop is a lot of somewhat mind-bending, sometimes dissonant note choices played very fast on a horn with a very fast rhythm section underneath you usually. It's not a one for the money, a two for the show. I need to get it now. Go, kid, go. It's the kind of about the American opposite of that at the time. Anyways, May goes on to say, I think that's very fine. And you've started touring the country, and you covered a lot of territory in the last 2 months, I believe. And Elvis says, yes, ma'am. I've covered a lot, mostly in West Texas, that's where my records are hottest. Around in San Angelo and Lubbock and Midland and Amarillo. May says, they tell me they almost mobbed you there, the teenagers. They like you so much. But I happen to know you've toured down in the eastern part of the country, too, down through Florida and around, and that people went for you there about as well as out in West Texas. Isn't that right? I mean, I love this. I personally love going like someone having to say about Elvis Presley, like, now I all the way from West Texas to Florida, people do tend to like you. Can you confirm or deny that? Elvis Aaron Presley. Yes, I think. Yes, madam. Yes, madam. I think I can confirm that based on the reactions I've been getting. But she's trying to sell him to people that might not know who he is yet in Florida. So, and Elvis says, well, I wasn't very well known down there. I'm with a small company and my records don't have the distribution that they should have. But May says, I watched you perform one time down in Florida and I noticed that the older people got as big a kick out of you as the teenagers. I think that was an amazing thing. Well, I imagine that's just the way all three of us move on the stage. We act like yes, and we mustn't leave out Scotty and Bill. They really do a terrific job of backing you up. They sure do. I really am lucky to have those two boys because they really are good. Each one of them have an individual style of their own. What I can't understand is how you keep that leg shaking just at the right tempo all the time you're singing. Well, it gets hard sometimes. I have to stop and rest it, but just automatically wiggles like that. Is that it? Just automatically does it? You started back in high school, didn't you? Singing around public performances with school and things of that sort? Well, no, I never did sing anywhere in public in my life till I made the first record. Is that right? Yes, ma'am. And then you just went right into their hearts, and you're doing a wonderful job. And I want to congratulate you on that. And I want to say, too, Elvis, it's been very nice having you in the studio. Well, thank you very much, May. And I'd like to personally thank you for really promoting my records down here because you really have done a wonderful job. And I really do appreciate it because if you don't have people backing you, people pushing you, well, you might as well quit. Now, the same night as that interview, May runs into one of her former students who's now like a nursing student. Elvis was on stage and May observes that she was right into it. Didn't know who he was. None of them did. But she was just, all of them were. Even some of the old ones were doing like that. I looked at their faces and they were loving it. And I said, hey, honey, what is it about this kid? And she said, oh, Ms. Axton, he's just a great, big, beautiful hunk of forbidden fruit. Now, the same week, they play in Orlando, and there's a local reporter named Jean Yothers who writes it up in the Orlando Central, May 16. And she wrote, what hillbilly music does to the hillbilly music fan is absolutely phenomenal. It transports them into a wild, emotional, and audible state of ecstasy. He never sits back, sedately patting his palms politely and uttering bravos of music appreciation. As his long-hair counterpart, he thunders his appreciation for the country-style music and nasal-twanged singing he loves by whistling shrilly through teeth, pounding the palms together with the whirling momentum of a souped-up paddle wheel, stomping the floor and ejecting yip-yip noises like the barks of a hound dog when it finally runs down a particularly elusive coon. That's the way it was, friends, at the Big Hank Snow Show, an all-star Grand Ole Opry Jamboree stage last week in Municipal Auditorium to jam-packed houses, both performances. It was as hot as blue blazes within the tired sanctums of the Barnish Auditorium, but the hillbilly fans turned out in droves and seemed oblivious to the heat. The whole shebang seemed like a cross between the enthusiasm displayed at a wrestling match. And by the way, folks, if you don't know what she's referring to, there are writings and podcasts by a fellow by the name of Jim Cornette that can clue you in. Wrestling matches in the South in the 1950s were off the fucking chain. People would try to climb into the wrestling ring with knives and other weapons to murder pro wrestlers back in those days. And the only security they had was be like a string of cops and a rope around the ring. It's not like today where the WWE or AEW shows up, with big barricades and stuff. It's just a ton of liquored up psychopaths out for blood watching two guys pretend to hurt each other and other people coming in to pretend to sort of screw over somebody in that match. And the people would get so pissed off. There would be blood. There would be actual blood. There would be, there would be a ton of arrests because the police would rather just beat the fuck out of somebody and then send them off on their way and teach them a lesson than they would. Let's call a SWAT team and bring them all downtown. Nope. It's just blood and violence. So people could get some of that aggression out. Anyways, that quote just reminds me of the first interview I ever read with Andreas Kisser and I think Max Cavalera from Sepultura back in a guitar magazine. His Guitar School magazine, like 92. And the opening of the article was, imagine a place where an American guitar costs as much as a house, and homelessness is a crime, often punishable by death. And over 50% of the children in that population are homeless. This is Sao Paulo, Brazil, home of thrash metal Brazilian band Sepultura. I'll never forget reading that. And I think it was Andreas, the lead guitarist, who said one of their shows had gotten so out of control. It was so violent. There were people with hatchets in the crowd, people with hammers in the crowd, people with machetes in the crowd, and like fighting with each other. He said it was almost as violent as going to a football game. That's what I just thought of when reading that quote about the wrestling matches for the first time in this book. Oh, God. Anyway, the article said, the whole shebang seemed like a cross between the enthusiasm displayed at a wrestling match and old-fashioned camp meeting. This was my first tangle with a hillbilly jamboree, a poignant contrast to Metropolitan Opera in Atlanta, I must say. I was awed, and with all due respect to opera in Atlanta, I got a tremendous boot out of this loud, uninhibited music that's sending the country crazy. Fair and Young was real sharp, singing that ditty about living fast, loving hard, dying young, and leaving a beautiful memory. I'm not familiar. Sorry, your narrator doesn't know Fair and Young. But what really stole the show was this 20-year-old sensation, Elvis Presley, a real sex box as far as the teenage girls are concerned. They squealed themselves silly over this fellow in orange coat and sideburns who sent them, sent as in, you send me, that sort of sending, with his unique arrangements of shake, rattle, and roll. And following the program, Elvis was surrounded by girlies asking for autographs. He would give each a long, slow look with drooped eyelids and comply. They ate it up. The crowd also ate up a peppy and perspiring Miss Martha Carson, calling the parquet singing spectators, "You folks are sitting over there on the shelves," and the same Miss Carson breaking two guitar strings and a pick with her strong strumming of This Old House and Count Your Blessings. Fans were forever rushing up near the stage, snapping flashbulb pictures during the program. And they all instinctively recognized a tune with recognizable roars before the second plunk of the guitar had been sounded. It was amazing. Hillbilly music is here to stay, you all. Which is written Y-O''ALL. Now, I haven't mentioned anything by Nick Tosches yet, but I'm gonna throw back to Country, the Twisted Roots of Rock and Roll by Nick Tosches. There's a chapter called Loud Covenants, where he covers the Sun Records explosion. And he talks pretty distinctly and in depth about rockabilly for various artists that were on Sun. Now, concerning Elvis, I can never take his words and like reformulate them to make it sound like I said them. So I'm gonna read straight from the page here. And this relates to the time we're talking about this tour. For the first time, one of Presley's records hit the national country charts. Baby Let's Play House rose to the number 10 position. As Baby Let's Play House was high on the charts, Elvis's last Sun disc was issued, Mystery Train, an R&B song Junior Parker had cut for Sun in 1953. Mystery Train is the song that opens Elvis, the John Carpenter film, with a shot along the side of the road, close up to the wheels of the car. If you're watching the film. If you're not, I don't know. Try to find the opening scene on YouTube or purchase it. You can purchase the Blu-ray or DVD on shout.com or something. Also included on the B-side, I Remember to Forget, written by Charlie Feathers and Stan Kessler. In Mystery Train, Scotty Moore showed the influence of Merle Travis. Now, speaking again as your narrator, Merle Travis was a key innovator in the creation of the solid body electric guitar, no matter what Les Paul said about having invented it all by himself, despite what the patents on the Les Paul say, seeing as how they have Ted McCarty's name on them. That's an aside I think I've brought up on a previous episode. Can't tell you which one. Back to the text. But you can find information about Merle Travis in Fender, The Inside Story. He was working on the West Coast with a band named Leo Fender, who was a radio repair person who completely changed the course of rock and roll and luthery, electric guitar building especially, for many, many, many generations. Thank goodness. It says, let's see, his guitar break toward the end of that record is an echo of the licks used by Merle Travis in his 1946 16 Tons. The record became a double-barreled hit, rising to number 1 position on the country charts. Elvis Presley, Rock and Roll Madman, had the best-selling country record in the nation. The year 1955 belonged to Elvis Presley and Blackboard Jungle. Late in 55, Elvis signed with RCA Victor. On January 5th, 1956, in Nashville, Elvis cut his first sides for his new label. Now, in addition to Scotty and Bill and drummer DJ Fontana, who joined the group early in 55, Nashville cats were involved. Guitarist Chet Atkins, pianist Floyd Kramer, vocal group Jordan Ayers. Elvis's first RCA Victor recording, Heartbreak Hotel, was released in February 1956. It became the number 1 song on both the country and the pop charts. Heartbreak Hotel was a superlative rockabilly song, full of austerity, sex, and stone-hard rhythm. The story of Heartbreak Hotel is this. Mae Boren Axton, songwriter and Hank Snow's PR lady, was shown in a newspaper clipping by her friend Tommy Durden, another songwriter. This clipping reported a suicide by a young man who had left a one-line note. I walk a lonely street. Now we know that goes directly to Down at the End of Lonely Street by Elvis, right? And it has to have been an indication that Mr. Billy Joe of a Green Day, walk a lonely road. I mean, maybe he came up with it himself. Maybe he heard that story. Who knows? But it seems to me that as much as I don't personally like Billy Joe's music, I do respect him a lot as a guy who knows rock and roll. He knows all kinds of shit about music. And I have to believe that he must have learned this story and used that for the intro to Boulevard of Broken Dreams. And I think, isn't Boulevard of Broken Dreams the title of is that the title of the painting that has like Marilyn Monroe and James Dean and Elvis Presley sitting in a diner together or something? I'm not looking it up. You figure it out. Call in now. Tell me if I'm wrong. Axton and Durden wrote the song Around the Line and made a tape of it within half an hour. The song was offered to the Wilburn brothers, who declined it. For the next 2 years, Elvis continued to cut strong rockabilly for RCA Victor. Hound Dog, originally done by Willie Mae Thornton on Peacock Records in 1952 and covered by Tommy Duncan, formerly lead singer with Bob Willis and his Texas Playboys. On intro in 1953, Don't Be Cruel, written for Elvis by Otis Blackwell. The demos Blackwell made at Charlie Brave's Allegro studio in the basement of a 1650 Broadway in New York City were masterworks. All the vocal Phillips and rhythmic heat of Don't Be Cruel, Great Balls of Fire, Fever, and other hits were copied directly from Blackwell's demos. Jailhouse Rock, Hard-Headed Woman, Elvis sometimes reached beyond the usual sources. Love Me Tender was taken from the traditional ballad R.A.I.N.N. With each new session, Elvis grew further from rockabilly. By the time he was drafted in the Army in 1958, the golden days of rockabilly had passed. As all things that contain more creativity than formula, more emotion than intellect, rockabilly cannot be precisely defined. As the word implies, rockabilly is hillbilly rock and roll. It is not a usurpation of black music by whites because its soul, its pneuma, was white, full of redneck ethos. When Elvis cut Big Boy Crudup's That's All Right, he was no more usurping black culture than Wynonie Harris was usurping white culture when he cut country singer Hank Penny's Bloodshot Eyes 3 years before. Presley's version of That's All Right is better than the original, just as Harris's version of Bloodshot Eyes is better than the original. There was an affinity between rockabilly and black music of the 1940s and 50s, as there had been an affinity between Western swing and black music of the 1920s and 30s, but it was not really more than an affinity. Of the 16 known titles Elvis recorded as a Sun artist, 5 were derived from R&B records. That's All Right, Good Rockin' Tonight, Milk Cow Blues Boogie, Baby Let's Play House, and Mystery Train. 2 of these, in turn, were derived to a certain extent from country records. Arthur Gunter's Baby Let's Play House from Eddie Arnold's 1951 hit, I Want to Play House with You, and Junior Parker's Mystery Train from the Carter family's 1930 Worried Man Blues. During his Sun years, as during the decades since, Elvis derived the bulk of his music from country and pop sources. What blackness there was in rockabilly in no way constituted an innovation in country music. The black enculturation in the music of old-timers, such as Jimmy Rogers and Bob Willis, was far greater, far deeper. Nor was there much of a technical nature in rockabilly that country music had not known before. The slap bass technique, one of the watermarks of classic rockabilly, can be heard in country records of the pre-war era, for example. Hear bassist Ramon D'Armon in the Light Crust Doughboys' 1938 Vocalion record, Pussy, Pussy, Pussy. The echo effect heard in many Sun rockabilly recordings had been used less subtly by Wilf Carter in his Victor records of the 1930s and by Eddie Arnold in his 1945 Cattle Call. The unique echo sound of the Sun studio was achieved through the use of tape loop delay and a 7.5 IPS instead of the more advanced 15 IPS 2-track recorder. The added echo effect heard in Scotty Moore's guitar relied on a custom-built amplifier made in Cairo, Illinois by a man named Ray Butts. Moore got the second amp that Butts built, the first one to Chet Atkins, the third to Carl Perkins, and the fourth to Roy Orbison. Oh my fucking God! Oh, Jesus! Oof. Sorry. I mean, as a guitarist and lover of gear, those names all in a row, those amps. Good Lord. That's just so wonderful. It's like a Mount Rushmore of of wonderful American rock and roll guitarists of the 50s. And unlike the people that are actually on Mount Rushmore, or I digress, they're probably not guilty of war crimes or rape or whatever. Anyways, they're not wearing dentures made with the teeth of their slaves, perhaps, like George Washington is on that mountain. And the mountain wasn't... All right, anyway. The mountain wasn't ripped off from Native Americans to carve in the faces of the people that murdered them or had them murdered. History, folks. Sorry. You can't have a passion for history without seeing the fundamental interconnectedness of all things. Now back to the text. When Moore ceased working with Elvis in September 1957, he put the amp in a closet. Several closets later, he withdrew it at Carl Perkins' request and plugged it in for one of Carl's Mercury sessions in early 1975. What made rockabilly such a drastically new music was its spirit, a thing that bordered on a mania. Elvis's Good Rockin' Tonight was not merely a party song, but an invitation to a holocaust. Junior Parker's Mystery Train was an eerie shuffle. Elvis's Mystery Train was a demonic incantation. Country music in recent years had not known such vehement emotion, nor had black music. Rockabilly was the face of Dionysus, full of febrile sexuality and senselessness. It flushed the skin of new housewives and made pink teenage boys reinvent themselves as flaming creatures. Now, we haven't talked about Lemmy yet, so let's talk about Lemmy, as you would expect on an Elvis episode. I wanted to grab a couple of quotes from his, autobiography, and just to give the British young person's perspective on what it took to get, singles or albums in the rock and roll era. He talks about how, if you wanted a record, you had to order it and wait a month for it to arrive from overseas. The first 78 I ever bought was by Tommy Steele, the British answer to Elvis Presley. And then I got Peggy Sue by Buddy Holly. My first full album was the Buddy Holly story, which I got right after he died. Actually, I saw him perform at New Brighton Tower. See, that shows your fucking age. I saw Buddy Holly live. Nevertheless, I must say, my street cred is impeccable. It was a long time before I bought an Elvis Presley record. The first I purchased was Don't Be Cruel. I believe his style, his look was great. He really was a one-off. But I thought he was inferior to Buddy Holly and Little Richard. The problem was he had really naff B-sides. See, albums in those days were different. An album could be a collection of the last 6 hit singles and the B-sides. So half of Elvis's albums were crap. He only started making good B-sides when he did I Beg of You. So let's take a second and look at the difference in the track listing between Elvis Presley, the RCA Victor debut album, in America versus England. In America, the track listing for side 1 is Blue Suede Shoes, I'm Counting on You, I Got a Woman, Ray Charles tune, One-Sided Love Affair, I Love You Because, and then Just Because. Side 2, Tutti Frutti, the Little Richard song, Trying to Get You, I'm Gonna Sit Right Down and Cry Over You, I'll Never Let You Go, Little Darlin', Blue Moon, and Money Honey. Now, these songs are all a maximum of 2 minutes and 43 seconds long. Most of them closer to 2 minutes or 2:20, generally. This is the stuff that when people ask, why was punk rock the way it was? It's because at the height of Emerson, Lake, and Palmer, there was a generation of young musicians that grew up on stuff like this. That wanted to play short, catchy songs. Anyhow, the UK edition Starts with Blue Suede Shoes as well. Then it goes straight into I Got a Woman. Then I'm Counting on You. And then a song called I'm Left, You're Right, She's Gone. Then That's All Right. Then Money Honey. Then Mystery Train, I'm going to Sit Right Down and Cry Over You. Trying to Get You. One-Sided Love Affair. Then Loudy Miss Cloudy. And Shake, Rattle, and Roll. A totally different track listing. Although, I don't know what Lemmy's problem is. I think I would prefer the UK edition, quite frankly. I think the songs are a lot stronger. And that's kind of how it goes for years and years and years in the recording business when it comes to overseas records. There's a lot of stuff that you can get in other countries you can't get in America, even from an American artist for various reasons. It's all about the distribution deals that somebody made with somebody else and who stands to make more money in another country selling those songs, and the prospect of maybe getting them on the radio. Did you notice I didn't mention a song called Heartbreak Hotel? Yeah, that's because financially it didn't make any sense to put Heartbreak Hotel on the full-length album. RCA knew, as a lot of record labels knew back in those days, if you had what you would think is a very strong single, you didn't put it on the album. You put it on a 45 or 78, I guess. You made it a single with a B-side. Because people that love that song and heard it on a jukebox or on the radio might not commit to buying a full LP, long play record album, but they would definitely plunk down the cash to just have an A-side and a B-side. And in this case, Heartbreak Hotel as a single outsold the dickens out of the full-length Elvis Presley LP on RCA Victor. But the point of that move was the single was what helped sell the LP. Because if they just put that song that they knew was going to be a hit on the LP, they wouldn't sell as much, but they could sell more singles, and enough people that bought the single would then want the album. And that's why the practice was to keep it off of the track listing of the full record, because they're not going to want to buy an album with, the song that's already on there that they just bought. I don't know why that wasn't more common practice years and years later, because by the time I was a teenager, it was always pretty standard that if you bought a single, that single was on the new album of that artist. But you would get B-sides that were like live versions or remixes, or in the case of some European acts, you would get the maxi single that had like 6 tracks on it. Because you have the 7-minute version to play in the discotheques when everyone's high on their cocaine and wanting to dance for a long, long time to the exact same beat. My favorite note about the making of the RCA Elvis Presley debut LP is that the echo that they used in the studio, including on Heartbreak Hotel and other songs, the slapback echo was done very organically by putting like a speaker in the hallway and then a microphone down the hallway and playing back, the track that they wanted to add echo to, because they couldn't figure out Sam Phillips's tape echo technique. They didn't understand that he was running a tape, through a second machine to create the delayed echoed sound. These sessions are around the time when you get DJ Fontana showing up as their drummer, who had never been in the band before. They never had a drummer before. This is why some of these early rockabilly acts sound the way they do, with the bass players that play as aggressively as they do, because they're creating the percussion in the band. Similar to Johnny Cash and the Tennessee 2. Now, this also brings in this time is when the Jordanaires appear more regularly at Elvis's behest. DJ Fontana gets sort of integrated into the band pretty nicely. I guess they start playing road dates around this time together with him in the band. He had some stories about, the boys that had already, they'd already been working together and making some road trips, themselves. And they already had some habits built up when it came to like arguing and fighting and who was better at driving at what time of day or what time of night, that kind of a thing. He talks about, the guys getting in arguments, and like DJ would be driving and they'd be like, pull over, and he'd pull over, and then the two of the guys would get out of the car and start yelling at each other. And I'm going to hit you. Well, I'm going to deck you. Well, you try it and I'll tell blah, blah, blah. And DJ's like, well, somebody hit somebody because we got to get to Memphis or we got to get to, Nashville in the next couple of hours. So let's get it over with. He wasn't used to that kind of thing. He says Elvis was a good driver if you led him in the right direction. And I don't know what specifically that means. If that means that if you held the roadmap and told him exactly where to go, he was okay. It's keeping the car between the lines on the road. I don't know what. That's not high praise. Scotty says, Scotty Moore, the guitarist, said about, this is when he learned that you kind of have to, he said, beat him in the head every morning to get him to wake up for a radio station appearance or whatever. He was always late. They were always so late that whatever they were wearing at the time was what they went on stage with. As soon as they got out of the car, they were walking straight to the stage and getting ready to play. So if they hadn't changed in advance, there was no stage clothes. And these are the days where they're still, touring with acts like Roy Orbison, Carl Perkins, Buddy Holly, Johnny Cash on a more regular basis. But Elvis is far and away the one standout artist on these bills that is causing hysteria in ways that the other acts just can't match. So it's uncomfortable to be his friend and then have to go on after him, to a reduced reaction from the crowd, to say the least. So let's talk about some of his qualities that might have brought these sorts of reactions. I think Peter Guralnick, the biographer, nails it very well in an interview that I saw with him, that Elvis's shyness was a genuine shyness, but it was a shyness he used for a purpose. His stillness made him the center that other people are drawn into and around. Peter said he had an omnivorous hunger for attention and a keen intelligence to get it without asking for it. And this, for me, is one of the things I think does a pretty good job of combating the argument that someone else could have been as successful as him if he hadn't taken that opportunity away from other artists, notably Black American artists. I think it's a big factor in this equation is that he was young and he was able to be manipulated by someone like the Colonel. Little Richard wasn't that. Little Richard was never ever still, and he had just refused to be controlled. I can't think, and I'm not enough of a scholar to suggest anybody. Let me say that for the record. I've done more homework than anybody I know, but I don't know of a legit Black artist that would have deservedly had the juice and the personality and the charisma and the energy that was necessary. The kind of not the amount of it. A lot of performers had the amount. I mean, like Louis Jordan is my probably favorite in that regard, but wrong place, wrong time. He would have been too old. But who has the right kind of juice and charisma to break through, but without enough self-interest to stop himself from being a pawn of someone like the Colonel that could make this rise to power happen so quickly and so profitably? And who could still be a terror to white America, while white American girls were going to make them a star with their sexual obsession with him? Fuck me if I know. I'm saying I don't know. Not saying it wasn't possible. I'm just saying I don't think Elvis is at age of 18 when he starts recording songs is a socio-political mastermind that's decided to take glory and power and money away from Black America via rock and roll. And he didn't even rip off artists to the degree that someone like Led Zeppelin did. Like, he recorded other people's songs and they got credit for it. If that publishing money that was due to those creators didn't get to them, that's not a singer like Elvis's fault. In fact, I think that's the only mention of Elvis in Little Richard's autobiography of any substance, is just talking about, how many songs of his Elvis recorded, and Little Richard did not get paid for those. People don't even know that Otis Redding wrote and recorded and performed Respect before Aretha Franklin did. She made that her song, and she made that America, like almost America's rallying cry for, what would be called feminism today. because it was highly feminist and revolutionary to say, hey, don't treat me like garbage for being a woman in a song that was a hit, of course. Led Zeppelin, who I love, blatantly just did songs with lyrics that had already been written by someone like Albert King or Richie Valens, and they called it something else in their song. And there's more than that, of course. I still listen to them, though. It's not my fault. And yeah, there were black American rappers that are way better than Eminem in 1999 when Eminem broke through. I mean, I'd say 20 years before him, quite frankly. Lyrics of Fury by Eric B. and Rakim. Check that out if you've never heard it, if you're a hip-hop, kind of lover or historian of any kind. A lot of people that like hip-hop in the modern day don't like anything that came before it. It's not the kind of genre that seems to lend itself well to the average person enjoying its history, unfortunately, and I kind of hate that about that fan base, quite frankly. I remember in 1999, I put on a Run DMC song from 1986 on at a party, and all these people asked me what. Well, actually, they didn't say what the fuck. They said what the hell. Like, what the hell is this? And I'm like, it's Run DMC. It's like the most important hip hop artists rap group in the history so far. As far as, cultural awareness, I would say, and this is a little bit of a tangent, but I'm making a comparison here because the business is in a different place in 1999, and Eminem had an opportunity that Elvis Presley didn't have because hip hop was established very well had been for, at least a couple of decades at that point. There was people like Dr. Dre and Snoop Dogg to sort of shepherd him into the business and provide their approval to what he was doing. Elvis didn't have that. Elvis was the first rock and roll superstar. And saying that he ripped off other artists is a matter of opinion, but when it came to the way he danced and being sexy and shaking his hips and shaking his leg, being something that he took from another culture, I may be naive, but it seems to me that when young people see stuff that they think is cool, they copy those physical mannerisms for themselves and they try to get girls doing it. That's not a big, huge breakthrough that only Elvis, was keen to to take credit for himself. It's like how older artists like Buddy Guy could point out the things that Jimi Hendrix did on stage that he had gotten from them. Guitar tricks, little movements with your hands and little movements with your body that changed things for them, and their sort of their own style on stage. Hendrix incorporated that into his own bag of tricks, but he combined them with a lot of other people's tricks. He also took it to another level entirely that these older guys in their Chicago clubs couldn't really do with the kind of audiences they had. Those audiences probably wouldn't have been all that receptive to it. So yeah, if Buddy Guy, B.B. King, Albert King, guys like that had been born later and then impressed some English guy who would take them to England and put them in front of a bunch of English people, yes, they could have possibly developed, enough stage persona and charisma to rival Jimi Hendrix's conquest of that country at the time and the women in it. But those guys were older and established sort of authorities. They weren't the ones that were going to be shy enough to take a job backing up Little Richard and then learn from him and then take some of his mannerisms and incorporate them into their own flamboyance. It wasn't in the cards. Anyway, I find it also similar to the Kinks and the Who being historically the ones who technically were observed by someone creating feedback sounds with their guitars and their amplifiers well before Hendrix did. But Hendrix made a symphony out of it, played it like a violin, the feedback. So having said all of that, the point I'm getting around to is I still don't think Elvis was racist, but I feel without a doubt in my heart and my mind and with all my conviction that the culture and the industry that made him famous and made rock and roll acceptable to large groups of the population through Elvis was absolutely racist. I understand if some of you feel like I'm harping on this a bit too much via this episode and a previous one, but a lot of people that still have this deeply held belief that somehow Elvis Presley owes reparations to all Black America. He did give back to his community, to Memphis, Tennessee. Annually, he would be at City Hall handing out Christmas checks totaling $55 $100,000 to 58 local charities. The mayor's office, in this photo that I'm seeing in the book Memphis, Birthplace of Rock and Roll, dated 1963, but I think he started doing so years before that. Basically, as soon as he got a lot of money, he spent the rest of his life annually putting money back into the community of Memphis, Tennessee. And that's black people and white people. Though I can't account for exactly what charities got that money, granted. And granted, everyone in this photograph in City Hall in the background is a white person. All right, that's the end of the race stuff. But I want you to know I didn't plan these episodes with the intention of like, I'm going to have a racial disclaimer and I'm going to have to tell everyone, I'm going to have to account for all. I know, it's just sort of started coming to me as I was writing and doing the research. And I think it was sparked by an excerpt I heard of Bill Burr talking about Elvis after arguing with his wife about the racial issue. The idea that Elvis had somehow stolen being sexy from Black America and took all the credit for it. And back to the RCA history, the history of the debut LP, is a large variety of genres on this for its time, and for such a young artist that was unknown for the most part around the country. Not in general, but as a bankable recording artist that could sell LPs. At the age of 20, on a debut album, there's like not a lot of artists you compare this to who had like slow ballad songs, and then country songs, and then R&B songs, and then rockabilly, and straight up rock and roll tunes. It's delicate balance. I noticed on the tracks listed, there's like 2 sessions that they're basically like made up of sessions that are 2 years apart. I didn't realize it took that long to finish the recordings on this. It was 2 distinct groupings of booked dates in the studio. All of it's, as mentioned elsewhere, these are not his songs. He had to pick from songs that RCA would send to him and request that he sing. He got the glory for singing the songs, of course, but other artists that had covered these in the past or had written these to sing for themselves in the past didn't have to endure the outrage and hatred Elvis got from his making them famous. I'm sure most of these artists would have happily traded places with Elvis in a second if they had had the chance. Just as I would happily trade places right now with whoever is currently heaving and breathing heavily on top of Scarlett Johansson or Stephanie McMahon or Tina Fey or Dana DiLorenzo. So what are we even talking about? Why do I keep harping on this? Well, because if some of those artists, those older artists or those black artists or unknown artists could have traded places with Elvis and make all those screaming white daughters of crew cut having white men slide off their chairs at every music venue they played and every TV studio they appeared on, they would have been lynched in the parking lot. The hypotheticals about this tend to bore me because it's as fruitless as asking, what if Janis Joplin or Jimi Hendrix or Jim Morrison hadn't overdosed on that fateful day? What would their careers have been like? And my thoughts are always the same. Well, then they would have likely overdosed a week later or a month later, or within the following year, to whatever degree fate or a really cheap drug dealer decided to be involved in their life. There's a subtlety in Elvis's delivery on the mic that his critics do not recognize, but everyone who loves a cock inside of him is apparently subjugated by every time they hear him or see him singing. If I'm wrong, then the Colonel would have died penniless at the age of 55. And to extend the metaphor into a larger timeline of Elvis's life, I think there's great irony in the fact that he was sexually crippled by so many deeply ingrained habits by the time his own child bride had gotten old enough and trained up enough by his manipulative ways of how to be the perfect mate for him, is a grand irony on the scale that Aesop himself must have smiled up from the depths of Hades or wherever he was and said, "Welcome to the party, pal," to Elvis's Christian God. Thumbs up to you for that cosmic irony. The most sexually desirable male on the face of most of the planet at that time, got everything he wanted from the woman he had groomed to be his perfect companion, and couldn't fulfill his end of the deal sexually. Not consistently and not long term. Obviously, he had lots of partners, but drug use and his weird hang-ups destroyed a lot of potential for him having lots of sex. Now, to wrap up the conversation about the RCA LP, Scotty Moore makes some pretty interesting comments about the recording sessions compared to the Sun recording sessions with Sam Phillips. He said, Sam knew how to treat Elvis's voice like an instrument, which is crucial to how those early recordings sound. Songs that were recorded in the studio at that time had 7 to 12 to 55 musicians, depending on, the session, providing all this cushiony support in the mix. And with, the RCA stuff, with Elvis's voice way out in front, digging into your ears. Sam knew from his blues and R&B recording experience to make the voice sit with the rhythm of the whole band by comparison. The Colonel made this deal happen. And the Colonel made RCA believe there were many more competitors for Elvis's contract than there actually were. The RCA staff didn't give two shits for rock and roll, and they didn't follow up on any of the things that he claimed. And they figured they'd give rock and roll a year or two before everything reverts back to Perry Como and artists like that. They forked over $40,000 for the contract. Atlantic, by comparison, had stopped negotiating once the price got up to $25,000. They just didn't have any more money budgeted for an artist like this. Colonel Tom Parker went to Sam Phillips and just asked, what's the price for the singer's contract? And Phillips said $35,000, plus $5,000 to pay back royalties that Sun owed to Elvis Presley, actually, at that time, which is a price that was considered astronomical. And all that makes it sound like the Colonel didn't actually get any payment for this deal, but he solidified himself as being the person taking half of Elvis's earnings from here on out, basically. There might be more detail to it than that, but that's the general the general gist of it. And to the industry's surprise, a couple years went by and things didn't go back to being dominated by older singers like Tony Martin or Perry Como or Tony Bennett or Frank Sinatra. This young man had become essentially the musical counterpart to James Dean, giving voice to a whole generation of young people that identified with him. And Heartbreak Hotel alone, compared to everything else that was on the pop charts, was pretty stark and grim sounding, with meaning the delivery, the subject matter, and the production of it. He picked out that song himself. Elvis famously disliked most of the songs that RCA offered him for the first album. Sam Phillips admitted he wouldn't have used that song at all. And maybe that's a sign that Sam Phillips was well and truly done having a proper direction for Elvis's career at that point. I've seen black and white TV footage of Elvis singing the song on some variety type show at this point, and the lighting on stage sort of shuts down the band. The guy's standing behind him. It's framed up nicely for them to be playing with him, but when he goes to Heartbreak Hotel, the spotlights come off of the three guys behind him, and it's just Elvis standing there holding his guitar, not playing it, and there's like horns and strings live somewhere off camera. It's on the Dorsey Show, I guess. Another appearance, though, later, March 17, 1956, on the Stage Show, the band, his own band, DJ Fontana, Scotty Moore, and Bill Black, are all actually playing live with him and being seen in the shot with him on stage. And Elvis's voice is way more authoritative and sexier, and the crowd responds in kind. He's not making the jump to being a crooner with an orchestra like the older guys that were dominating the charts. He's firmly entrenched in rock and roll, but of course, as time goes on, he'll get further and further away from it. I think he just loved gospel music so much that he wasn't going to stay in the rhythmic sort of land of opportunity that rockabilly had for him very long anyway. I'd be curious to know if he had stayed with more of a rockabilly sound, would rockabilly have lasted longer, or would it have dried up any old way, and Elvis would have eventually stopped? Now, as we did in the previous episode, let us continue on with more searches through Priscilla Presley's memoir. That's right, it's time for Priscilla Presley Bingo. And the words I chose to Control F search on the digitized PDF version of her book that I found on archive.org were to be temper, shocked, both those we went over last time, uneasy, embarrassed, sex, drug, and passed out. I think passed out has 2 results, and I don't think they mean unconscious, so we might skip that one. I did just check sex. There are 7 results in the book. Not all of them worth going over, but the first mention is around page 20. It says, my mother was too shy to talk about the facts of life, so my sex education came in school. And it's not what you think, folks. It comes because 6th graders are passing around a book that looks from the outside like a Bible. And inside, there's pictures of men and women making love, and women making love to each other. That would have done me a lot better, I think, than what I knew by the time I was in 6th grade. Oh, well. Further on, around the 130-page mark, there's a little hang time with Elvis, Priscilla, and a bunch of the fellas in his group of friends. And he's recently been making a cinematographic film movie. And they're having pork chops, cornbread, home fries, and Crowder peas. They're sitting around a table. Local friends had dropped by to catch up on all the gossip about Elvis's latest movie, she says. Goddamn, she was a big woman, Elvis was saying about his co-star. Body like a man. No hips. And shoulders broader than mine. I was embarrassed to take my goddamn shirt off next to her. Yeah, but Alan Fortas kidded him. She only had eyes for you. No way, son. Not with John Derek lurking all over. I guess he was hanging around her all the time on the set. And whenever Elvis started a conversation with her, he'd catch the guy glaring at him, according to Elvis. He says, he gave her a car. And on the steering wheel, it said, baby, you're indispensable. Head over heels in love with her. Never saw anything like it. Priscilla was a bit surprised to hear Elvis talking about Ursula Andress, who she calls the alluring sex goddess of Dr. No, the first James Bond film. Thusly, wasn't she pretty? I asked. Pretty, he snickered. Hell, she had a bone structure so sharp, it could cut you in half if you turned too fast. Everyone howled, Priscilla says, including me. Elvis's stories went on for hours. Again, I felt out of touch with the conversation and wished I had some colorful stories of my own. I kept wondering when we were going to have some time alone. My world consisted solely of him. I sat quietly, happily observing him. Whenever he winked at me or gave my hand a little squeeze, I returned the gesture, thinking, now? Does he want me to leave so he can follow me? But then he'd lean back in his chair and begin telling another story. Oh, and then this part's creepy. She says it was just before dawn when he yawned and said, well, we better get some sleep. And everyone rises up from the table. And in front of everyone, Elvis looks over at Priscilla and smiles and says, do I have to write a note for school saying you were sick today? Think they'd believe me? And everybody laughed. So they go upstairs to his room. Priscilla was very self-conscious about making sure she appeared cool because something he once told her was that he detested aggressive women. She had to be very conscious of that at all times, I guess. And even when she's really excited to finally be alone with him for a while. Now, she's already in bed about 15 minutes before he gets out of his bathroom and starts counting out a number of his usual regiment of sleeping pills and starts taking them one at a time. She asks why. Why is he taking those now? Because he's going to fall asleep. And she had some plans to, fool around as they were doing at that time. He says, don't worry, it'll take a while for them to take effect. Here, just take one of these and you'll get a good night's sleep. It's okay since you're not going to school this morning. I wouldn't advise it on school nights, though. So he gives her this pill. She's worried it's going to knock her out for like days at a time. He assures her it'll be A-okay. And she starts to get, body high and tingly, and they start getting cuddly. They start fooling around a little bit. I'm not really glossing over anything explicit because she doesn't get in any detail, but she talks about really wanting him and wanting to, finally break the seal with Elvis. And he kind of puts her off of it and says they have to wait until they're married, and he's going to hold out until then. It's not going to be a problem. She says that she sort of sits up at one point angry at him. Said, what about Anita? I yelled. You mean you didn't make love to her the whole 4 years you went with her? Just to a point. Then I stopped. It was difficult for her too, but that's just how I feel. That's how you feel? What about me? How long do you think this can go on? God, Elvis, that takes a lot of willpower. That's asking a lot of another person, one who's in love and has strong, healthy desires. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying we can't do other things. It's just the actual encounter. I want to save it. Fearful of not pleasing him, of destroying my image as his little girl, I resigned myself to the long wait. Instead of consummating our love in the usual way, he began teaching me other means of pleasing him. We had a strong connection, much of it sexual. The two of us created some exciting and wild times. And that's about as much as you're going to get. She goes into talking about taking Polaroid photos of each other, playing dress up, directing each other through like play fantasy things. She dressed up in her school uniform and pretend to be a schoolgirl or she was a schoolgirl or a secretary and or a teacher seducing her student. She said we were always inventing new stories, and eventually I learned what stimulated Elvis the most. Apparently she made a almost nightly habit of going to the drugstore to buy more Polaroid film cartridges. And because, people cared about that kind of thing back in the day in a small-ish town compared to the big city, I guess she got self-conscious that they all at the cashier's, desks would know who she was and have reasons to believe she was doing something illicit and was making excuses like a kid would. Oh, I guess the last ones were defective. I better buy some more. Oh, someone stole my film. I need to buy some, who needs to know this? In real life, in public, nobody. But time's a little different. The place is different. And she's with Elvis, for crying out loud. Even though she's not saying that to these people and she's wearing, sunglasses and things to like a disguise. But she doesn't elaborate on the physicality of these intimate acts at all. She just says, Elvis and I both loved creating these sexual fantasies, and it seemed to be bringing us closer together. I had no previous sexual experience to compare with his inventive sexuality, but I was ready to indulge him any way I could. Being in the fast lane, he was exposed to every pleasure available in life. Ordinary thrills sometimes were not enough, especially when he was under the influence of powerful drugs. And she eventually ends this chapter with a statement, I fulfilled his needs, and his beliefs became mine. Under no circumstances were his ideas or playfulness perverted or in any way harmful. And I'll skip over the mentions of the word sex through the rest of the book because they kind of just amount to using the phrase, the stronger sex, with Elvis pointing out that as a woman, it's her duty to stay by his side and support him, but not be so willful at the times when it bothers him. And then the next three are about controlling the sex desire and, the part of his life where he was, not banging her because he had to save his essence or some BS like that. Now let's jump to the word uneasy, which has three results, and at least one of them is worth reading into. The first one is she was uneasy about asking him any questions on a particular day when he decided they should go to Las Vegas together. The second one was mentioned that he was uneasy about flying because he had a fear of it. But then quite a bit later towards the end of the book, she talks about when they were in Vegas. She said she felt more comfortable at the openings. Everyone's prepping for the first show of a string of shows at one particular venue for a certain period of time, and she feels like she's at least being useful to Elvis by being supportive and being enthusiastic there. And, up to this point, she's gone from it seems like she's gone from being, 14 years old and sort of handed over to him by her dad, who facilitates the process, although not really. That's an oversimplification, but her dad approved of it, even though she was so young, even though he had plenty of rules about it, to them, finally spending time together as husband and wife, but during a time when he was more active and traveling more and trying to keep her from all the craziness, it sounds like. I haven't read her book, obviously. I've just been flipping around through it. But this portion of her story clearly makes it obvious that she's giving up the idea that they could ever actually be together the way she had envisioned for years. So she points out how he was always preoccupied with the show, and she felt very needed by him at that time. On closing nights, that's when she felt, and here's the word, uneasy. Too many days had gone by, enough time for suspicions to poison my thoughts, and she's putting all this on herself. The Vegas maitre d's invariably planted a bevy of beauties in the front rows for the entertainer to play to. Curious, I would scan their faces while watching Elvis closely to see if he seemed to direct his songs to any girl in particular. Suspicious of everyone, my heart ached, but we were never able to talk about it. I was to be accepted as part of the job. It was to be accepted as part of the job. Backstage one night, Vernon was jokingly negotiating for a key that had been tossed to Elvis. She was an attractive middle-aged blonde, Vernon's type. Elvis said, "Daddy, you've got enough problems at home with one blonde. You certainly don't need two." "Well, okay," Vernon said. "You're going to have problems of your own if your wife goes out in the street looking like that." Dick move, Dad. I had begun wearing skimpy knit dresses and see-through fabrics. Woohoo. They were daringly revealing. Lamar and Charlie whistled and gave wolf calls, while Elvis proudly showed me off. She also talks about how she played little jokes on him while he was doing these shows to sort of get more of his attention. One night, I guess she's back at probably the hotel room. He'd already left early for a show, and she puts on a black dress with a black hood and a super low cut back. Then she waits in the audience for the time when Elvis starts giving away kisses to the girls, which is a regular thing every night. She goes up to the stage, and instead of kissing Priscilla, Elvis keeps on singing the song, leaving her standing there in front of everybody. And she says that with my hair hiding the dress strap around my neck, I appeared from the back to be nude from the waist up. And she could hear the oohs and ahs of the audience thinking that this topless broad had cornered Elvis, and he couldn't figure out what to do. She keeps whispering to him, "Kiss me, kiss me, kiss me so I can sit down." But now he knows he's got her, so he's not going to do that. He's going to keep on singing until the song's over and plants a big kiss, and then turns her around and introduced to the audience, and she feels embarrassed and, sneaks back to her seat. She says later in the show he would sort of strut around and tease the audience, tell them stories, make jokes, and say things like, people in this town get a little greedy. I know you folks come along, save a long time to come hear me sing. I just want you to know, as far as I'm concerned, there won't be any exorbitant raise in price when you come back. I'm here to entertain you, and that's all I care about. She finishes this section saying, he was having an ongoing love affair with his audience, and the next time I was home alone, I knew I had no choice but to start more of a life of my own. I want to talk about a couple of record industry notes, specifically the RCA era still, or again, rather, I guess I should say, since we just detoured into Priscilla and then away from RCA. But there's a really funny, weird, perplexing fact about his singles for RCA. They paid more money than, according to the book 45 RPM, The History, Heroes, and Villains of a Pop Music Revolution by Jim Dawson and Steve Probst. It was late 55 when RCA Victor paid more money than it ever spent before to acquire young Elvis Presley from Tiny Sun Records. The company was occasionally issuing pop 45s with black and white picture sleeves. Yet it slotted none of them for their bonus baby's first 7 releases. Not even Elvis's first 2 number 1 hits, Heartbreak Hotel and I Want You, I Need You, I Love You. However, an early promo 45 was sent to disc jockeys with a special This Is His Life for panel cartoon sleeve, humorously describing how Presley got to where he was. The sleeve was never issued for the general public, and there's still some confusion among collectors and archivists whether it accompanied RCA's first Presley 45, Mystery Train, or the later I Want You, I Need You, I Love You. In any event, RCA's lack of foresight gave the Singing Dogs Hot Dog of Rock and Roll, Hot Dog Rock and Roll, the honor of being its first so-called rock and roll 45 with a picture sleeve. With Elvis not getting one, let me look ahead here, and still only in black and white. Oh, it was Hound Dog after he was on the Steve Allen Show, which we'll talk about in a bit. Yeah, it was. I guess it was a photo of him. I think from the appearance of him singing to that basset hound while he was wearing a tux and tails. Funny thing though about that one, despite the image that they used for it, they had actually designated Don't Be Cruel as the A-side of that 45. So eventually, Hound Dog turned out to be the bigger hit, and the order was reversed by RCA. So if you had the original version with Don't Be Cruel on top in the larger print, that one's worth twice as much to collectors as the other version. Now in November 56, Love Me Tender replaces Hound Dog at the top of the charts, and now RCA decides to issue 4 different picture sleeves, all using the same photo of Elvis sitting on the set of his film Love Me Tender with his guitar, but each one had a different color to it. The original was black and white. The other 3 were tinted light pink, dark pink, or green. From then on, of course, Elvis was popular enough to sort of demand, or his popularity demanded, that he gets full color, basically pinups. That's what these sleeves become. They are, it's like a Playboy centerfold for people that have the hots for Elvis to look at with their record single. And he would get these full color photo sleeves from RCA all the way up until his death with Pledging My Love in August 1977. But he was not RCA's first artist to get a full sleeve, full color treatment. They actually had given that to Harry Belafonte on 2 singles, John Henry and Danny Boy, using the same photo on both, though. But it's very likely because of Elvis Presley's popularity that RCA Victor became the industry leader in very dynamic photograph full color sleeves on their records from that point on. As they say, necessitation is the motheration of inventoriety. And when it's necessary for you to get good at doing something quickly, because people demand it, and, they don't have Bop Magazine or Teen Beat or Tiger Beat or even Circus Magazine or what have you for rock star pinup things to look at, or, Dreamboat, Famous Boy pinup magazines to go with yet. The photographers and layout artists at RCA clearly had to get good at what they were doing and repeat that process over and over and over again. So, of course, that's going to spread. That expertise is going to, start affecting all the other artists and their presentation on RCA as well. Now, I also wanted to read a quick entry in the liner notes booklet for the Rhino Records set Loud, Fast, and Out of Control, The Wild Sounds of 50s Rock, under the listing for My Boy Elvis by Janice Martin. This was, of course, an RCA Victor single, recorded in May of 1956. The text says, My Boy Elvis might just be the first of a few thousand songs about Elvis. It also showed how self-referential rock and roll had already become. Co-writer Aaron Schroeder went on to write It's Now or Never, I Got Stung, Good Luck Charm, and many others. RCA called in some New York jazzmen for this date, led by guitarist George Barnes. You'd never know they weren't a jumping little hillbilly band. Janice was billed as the female Elvis Presley, apparently with Elvis's consent. The female Elvis met the male Elvis twice. Only once did they chat. He said, How's it going? She said, Fine, how about you? He said, It's rough. And then below that listing in the tracks on that disc is My Baby Left Me by Elvis Presley, the Arthur Crudup song. This is an RCA Victor single. The book notes it as the fabulous B-side of I Want You, I Need You, I Love You, recording in New York for the first time in January of 1956. Elvis made it clear that he liked few, if any, of the songs presented to him, so he retreated to his home turf. He launched his career with Arthur Big Boy Crudup's That's All Right, and seems wholly at ease on another of Crudup's brisk, swinging, unorthodox blues. Down in Tupelo, Mississippi, Elvis once said, I used to hear Arthur Crudup bang his box the way I do now, and I said that if I could ever got to the place where I could feel how old Arthur felt, I'd be a music man like no one ever saw. And he did. And he was. All right, spring of 1956, the fellas are on the road. Colonel Tom Parker is booking them lots of shows. RCA has a schedule they're trying to keep, and they want a second album out by April 15th. Or no, ready by April 15th for a scheduled release in the fall of that year. And they're writing to the Colonel saying, I know you have Elvis on a heavy personal appearance program, and I certainly can't blame you. But the main purpose of this letter is to point out that we still must get a number of additional recordings from Elvis in the near future. That was actually written in February of 56, and by mid-April, they still had nothing to show for their time and their money and their pleas to the Colonel. Then at this point, they are doing a Texas tour, San Antonio, Amarillo, Corpus Christi, and Waco, and that's where Elvis gives a very brief interview on Tuesday night, shortly before walking out on stage. So this isn't like any respected or respectable performer of any given time that we would consider, I think, that would need time backstage alone, or at least with their own musicians to sort of get focused, get ready. All kinds of performers do that stuff. They have their rituals. They have to get centered. They have to forget about everything they've been thinking about all day long, clear their heads, get limbered up, get ready, and be the best kind of performer they can be before they go on stage. Well, not for Elvis, and not in these days, apparently. He's giving an interview to the Waco News Tribune reporter, B. Ramirez. What do you want to know about me, honey? He said as he stared out at the 4,000 screaming teenagers from backstage. Half scared, wrote Ramirez, and half unbelieving. Elvis, have you any idea just what it is that started the girls going crazy over you? Imagine 4,000 screaming fans are right there, and some idiot from a newspaper is asking you dumb questions like this, and you have to humor them. Well, I guess this is how you deal with it. No, I don't, he said. I guess it's just something God gave me. I believe that, Know what I mean, honey? And I'm grateful. Only I'm afraid. I'm afraid I'll go out like a light, just like I came on. Know what I mean, honey? Presley has a way with that honey business when he talks. He looks straight ahead, or sort of dreamy, like in no direction at all. Then he turns with that, know what I mean, honey? His face is close, real close, right in your face, almost. Elvis, I hear you walk in your sleep. Well, I have nightmares. What kind? I dream I'm about to fight somebody, or about to be in a car wreck, or that I'm breaking things. Know what I mean, honey? I don't have any idea what he means. Where are you from? From Memphis, Tennessee. Oh, yes. That's where all the hillbilly singers come from, isn't it? Maybe so, but I'm no hillbilly singer. Well, have you typed your type of singing? No, I don't dare. Why? 'Cause I'm scared. Know what I mean, honey? Real scared. What of? I don't know. Know what I mean, honey? At this point, I thanked him for his time and started to make a beeline for the door. He grabbed my hand, sat there, looking sleepy-eyed into my face, and fanned his long lashes while he said, wrap me up good, will you, honey? So then, the following Saturday night, on April 21st, they play 2 shows in Houston at the City Auditorium. At the end of the first show, the crowd would not leave. So Elvis leaves the predominantly female audience with the thought that it's been a wonderful show, folks. Just remember this. Don't go milking the cow on a rainy day. If there's lightning, you may be left holding the bag. The Houston Chronicle reported 4,000 females just died. Now, what's cool is Elvis and Scotty then take off to a club across town, Club El Dorado, where blues singer Lowell Fulson is headlining. He had had a big hit the year before with Reconsider Baby. He was a regular at the Club Handy and the Hippodrome in Memphis. So, big favorite of Dewey Phillips. Dewey Phillips was a DJ that had started playing some of Elvis's songs before a lot of other people had heard them. During the break, Scotty introduces himself and Elvis, and Fulson called them up on stage for a couple of tunes during the next set. It was a highly memorable experience for Scotty. He says, I remember me and Lowell standing up toe-to-toe, getting down on some blues. One of those, recalled Lowell, was Big Joe Turner's Shake, Rattle, and Roll. I don't know what the other one was. Anyway, Elvis sounded good, and the house accepted it. So he, meaning Scotty, said, what do you think of him? What do you think of the boy? I said, well, one thing, he's a pretty boy, and the women will make him. He won't have to work too hard. He got a big bang out of that. He laughed for a good while. Next day, Sunday, they get on a flight for Las Vegas. Now, in Vegas, they have booking for 2 weeks in the 1,000-seat Venus room at the New Frontier Hotel. $7,500 a week, which the Colonel was said to have demanded in cash, because as he tells Time magazine, no check is good. They got an atom bomb testing place out there in the desert. What if some feller pressed the wrong button? So, now when Elvis shows up in Las Vegas, there is a 24-foot high cutout of Elvis Presley himself standing out in front of the hotel beside the casino entrance. It is the same action photograph taken in Florida in the summer of '55 that had been on the cover of his first album, and the song folio and any number of additional publicity items that the Colonel could have used it for up to that point. His name was also on the marquee just below comedian Shecky Green. He was listed as extra added attraction Elvis Presley, and in the print ads for this 2-week engagement, he was referred to as the atomic-powered singer. Now, this is a show that has an orchestra, like a professional Vegas ballroom kind of group of musicians that are sort of opening the festivities and entertaining the cocktail lounge casino crowd that are there to sort of get a peek for the first time at what Elvis Presley is. It is led by bandleader Freddie Martin, who had specialized in pop arrangements of the classics. So, orchestrated music for people that don't like music, basically. And I assume this process is just sort of a stripping down of arrangements and making them a little more pleasing to the unmusical ear and people with short attention spans. Like a friend of mine complained that his mother had a bunch of classical music CDs in the 90s, but they were all edited to only include the main themes of these classical songs, like Beethoven's Fifth would be only minutes long. Dun, 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 dun. It'd be all the parts that you already knew without all the extra movements and stuff. So Peter Grolnick's book says of this situation, I guess, with Mr. Martin. He'd been enjoying hits consistently since 1933, featured a $40,000 floor show including a 17-piece orchestra, 28 singers, twin pianos, dancers, ice skaters, and selections from Oklahoma. On opening night, New Frontier Vice President T.W. Richardson, who, according to Gabe Tucker, had first heard Elvis in his hometown of Biloxi, and contacted the Colonel about booking the month before. So the month before this engagement is when the first contact was made with the Colonel. So RCA Victor is like, when the hell are we finishing the second record? And like, oh, sorry, gotta go to Vegas, gotta go to Texas. I don't know what to tell you, fellas. Good Lord. I guess, and he had invited a bunch of friends up from Houston to catch the show. Elvis is the closing act of the night. As the Freddie Martin Orchestra played their arrangement of Rock Around the Clock, which I'm sure was very, very hip, the curtain rose to reveal a very nervous, very out-of-place hillbilly quartet. Scotty and DJ and Bill were all wearing light-colored sports jackets, dress pants, bow ties, and white shirts, while Elvis was dressed neatly in loafers, dress pants, and black bow tie. The light-colored western-cut checked sports jacket with a dark, cowled collar. From the opening notes of the song that he introduced as Heartburn Motel to his stammered attempts to thank Freddie Martin for the nice introduction, you could hear a pin drop. When Elvis started singing, Tucker related, one of Richardson's guests jumped up from their ringside table and shouted, "God damn it! Shit! What is all this yelling and screaming? I can't take this. Let's go to the tables and gamble." Oh, Bill Black said, for the first time in months, we could hear ourselves when we played out of tune. After the show, our nerves were pretty frayed, and we would get together in pairs and talk about whoever wasn't around to defend himself. They weren't my kind of audience, said Elvis. It was strictly an adult audience. The first night especially, I was absolutely scared stiff, but afterwards, I got a little more relaxed, and I finally got him on my side. We didn't even know we were failures, said Scotty. But after that night, reported Billboard, they no longer closed the show. And I have to read the next line at the top of the next paragraph. Nonetheless, he persisted. He played out the full 2 weeks, and his hometown reporter Bob Johnson wrote, Elvis, who has played hard audiences before, kept right in there bursting guitar strings and shaking his legs and the rafters, and the ice began to break. Bill Randall, who viewed the engagement almost as a social embarrassment, had arranged to have some of the performances filmed, and Hal Willis showed up to check out his investment. Judy Spreckles, an attractive 24-year-old divorced sixth wife of Sugar King Adolph Spreckles II, whom Elvis had met briefly in California, showed up and served as his secretary. Now, I love the fact that some curious Vegas celebrities showed up. I don't know their names, except for the obvious one here. Ray Bolger, Phil Silvers, and Liberace were prominent in the audience. There is film as a result of this visit of Elvis and Liberace clowning it up for the camera. Liberace, one of Elvis's mom's favorite performers, so he made sure to get his autograph for his mom, is pretending to play Scotty's guitar while Elvis flings himself into it, throwing his head back and laughing easily as he sings, perhaps, Blue Suede Shoes. Not to be upstaged, Liberace draws a square in the air pointing at his brother George. It is in many ways a picture of perfect innocence. I have to believe that's where that little Bugs Bunny gag of when he's at the piano and he cracks his knuckles and he says, "I wish my brother George were here." I never thought that was Liberace, but maybe that's what it was because it seems to make sense with the voice he was doing. Does anyone know what I'm talking about? If you do, call in now and reassure me. So Elvis ends up loving Las Vegas because it never goes to sleep, and he doesn't want to go to sleep, at a normal time. He wants to get up late. He wants to stay out all night, and the city is happily, sort of set up to accommodate people like him in ways that other towns in the United States obviously do not. He gets to hang around the pool at the hotel, flirt with girls, because he can still do that at this point without getting drowned by a pack of angry boyfriends of said girls. He goes around carousing with, his friends, shows up in various nightclubs or casino rooms. Showgirls are fawning all over him. He's not drinking. He's not gambling. He's keeping his nose clean. Now, the New Frontier seems to be getting kind of wise to the fact that this act is not for the older folks that are the Liberace crowd, right? And they set up on the first Saturday of that 2-week engagement a teenage matinee for just Elvis Presley fans. Proceeds from this show are supposed to go toward lights for a youth baseball park, and there was some semblance of a normal Elvis Presley gig at this, engagement. Finally, Bob Johnson wrote, "The carnage was terrific. The golden boy reaches for a star while the music goes round and round, and they pushed and shoved to get into the 1,000-seat room, and several hundred thwarted youngsters buzzed like angry hornets outside. After the show, bedlam. A laughing, shouting, idolatrous mob swarmed him. They got his shirt, and it was shredded. A triumphant girl seized a button, clutched it as though it were a diamond." By the end of the 2-week run, Mr. Martin, the band leader, was a lot more respectful of Elvis and even got a little cheeky on stage with his banter. After, Elvis's act was done one night, he announced, "We should have 5 minutes silence now. Makes me wonder if I've been wasting my time for the last 20 years. One of the casino owners, Frank Williams of Osceola, Arkansas, gave him an $800 watch with diamonds for the numbers. Elvis reciprocated with half a dozen letters of thanks. Even the colonel, who was initially discomfited by what amounted to the first misstep in a series of otherwise perfectly calculated moves, seemed finally to have come to terms with the value of the experience. In Scotty's view," obviously I'm reading directly from the text again, this is Peter Gorelnick's words. "In Scotty's view, I think in one sense it was good because it was completely different. That's what's funny about Vegas. People that were there, if you lifted them out and taken them over to San Antonio, the big Coliseum, that they'd been going crazy. It's just a different atmosphere, but we had a ball out there. We really did." Last night of the engagement, Elvis tries to make some jokes to the crowd, and they don't really go over. He's giving his thanks to them, and as the applause dies down, he says, "I would like to tell you it's really been a pleasure being in Las Vegas. This makes our second week here, and tonight's our last night. And we've had a pretty hard time. Had a pretty good time while we were here," and introduces Blue Suede Shoes by saying, "This song is called 'Get Out of the Stables, Grandma, You're Too Old to Be Horsing Around.'" And then that doesn't get a laugh. He turns to the orchestra leader and says, "Do you know that song, Mr. Martin? You do? You know the one about 'Take Back My Golden Garter, My Leg is Turning Green'?" And then the band leader kind of calls him back for an encore later. He says, "Thank you, friends. I was coming back anyway." Newsweek called him a jug of corn liquor at a champagne party. Elvis Presley coming in on a wing of advanced hoopla doesn't hit the mark here, says Variety. Life magazine on April 30th said it was a howling hillbilly success. And a Halifax radio station had declared that it gave away all of its Elvis Presley records in hopes that it would hear no more. Elvis responded by saying he didn't even know that there were radio stations in Nova Scotia. But he said, the more they try to ban this stuff, man, the more they'll have to listen to. I mean, man, a lot of people like it, man. It's really hot right now. I was strumming the guitar in Mississippi before I ever came to Memphis. My father bought one for $12. It was the best investment he ever made. That was an interview he gave to a newspaper when he got back home. All right, gang. Let's do another round of Priscilla Presley Bingo. This time, I am doing a Control F search through her book of the word embarrassed. The first instance is early on. She's talking about being a young teenager in school, embarrassed about her own sexuality. Fair enough. Moving on from there. Page 53, she talks about Elvis taking some pills. Around the time that, let's see, he was in the Army, a sergeant had given several men pills to help them stay awake while on guard duty. Elvis, who was accustomed to living the life of an entertainer and who despised rising at dawn, began taking the pills to get him through the long, dreary hours of Army life. And I guess these are dexedrine pills. He told me he'd begun taking sleeping pills shortly before he'd been drafted. He dreaded insomnia and feared sleepwalking, which had plagued him periodically since childhood. In fact, as a boy, he'd once sleepwalked straight out of his apartment, dressed in only his underwear. A neighbor woke him and, embarrassed, he ran back into the house. Another time, he nearly fell out of a window. Consequently, to avoid accidents, he slept with his parents until he was grown, and he feared his sleepwalking habit for the rest of his life. It was one of the reasons he usually had someone sleeping with him. Years later, I learned that someone had been employed in Germany to watch over him throughout the night. So that ties into, the family being so much of a factor in his adult life and him being so unusually close with his mother, among other factors, of course, and his dependence on other people for his safety in general, and his dependence upon pills for getting up and going to bed. The next embarrassed mention in the book is just Priscilla showing up in Las Vegas to see Elvis after having been away from him for a while. And, she's, crying a little. She's embarrassed. Everyone's looking at them because he's like hanging out with all of his friends playing pool in some room up in a hotel in Las Vegas. All right. Then we've got her embarrassed because she couldn't sleep. She couldn't sleep, and Elvis wakes up, and she's embarrassed that Elvis has caught her staring at him and studying him. Sitting up, he said, "Well, little girl, the coffee. Press number 4 on the intercom and tell Billy to order us some breakfast. He knows what I like, and just tell him what you want. Tell him to have it here in half an hour and to make sure the coffee's hot." He gets out of bed, he turns on the TV, walks in the bathroom, comes out, and says, "Get dressed, little one. I want to show you off a little." "That was all I needed to hear," Priscilla says. "I jumped out of bed and ran into my bathroom to get ready. As I dressed in a casual summer outfit, I could hear music coming from the living room. I cracked open the adjoining door and was surprised to see all the boys up and dressed with breakfast set up on the dining room table. I finished combing my hair and walked out to the living room where the guys greeted me with friendly smiles and hellos. Elvis wasn't there yet, so no one had begun eating. And apparently this is after 4 in the afternoon. And then it goes on for a little bit as Elvis comes out in a 3-piece suit, and that makes Priscilla feel really uncomfortable because she has nothing comparable to wear out, nothing fancy. But he puts on a record for the whole room to listen to. It's an early version of one of his newer recordings. She talks about how kind of exciting that always was to hear these tunes before the public did, before they were finished. And then the next embarrassed comes up in a couple of paragraphs. So Elvis asks her what she thinks of the song. And she says, well, since, she knew what people back in Europe, especially the kids, were into, she says, I really like the fast-paced ones like Jailhouse Rock. Why don't you record more songs like that? These don't seem as much like rock and roll as your early records. Good girl, Priscilla. Goddamn right. Anyway, Elvis gets pissed off and says, God damn it, I didn't ask for your opinion on what style I should sing. I asked if you like the songs, that's all, yes or no. I got enough amateur opinions as it is. I don't need another one. So he gets up, walks in the bedroom, slams the door, and leaves Priscilla there with all of his buddies trying to fight back tears and feeling embarrassed. But, oh no, I tell a lie. Looking at it again. The guys had already left, so she was by herself. That might be worse. I don't know. Another mention of being embarrassed is being at the tables in the casino and yelling 21 when Elvis looks at her cards and tells her she's got 22. She's so embarrassed that she goes to the ladies' room to hide for a while. Then there's another instance we've already talked about. His co-star that he said had a body like a man. Elvis said he was embarrassed to take his shirt off next to her. After that, there's a bit she wrote about in her diary. Right before that, she talks about, newly being a mother and Elvis newly being a father. And I think leading up to that word embarrassed, it's important to let her tell her part of this story. She said, since the baby was born, we were spending more time at Graceland, eventually moving all the horses back to the original stables. Vernon, that's his dad, selling much of the equipment, and later the Circle G itself. So they must have had a ranch somewhere with horses and barns and stuff. And it's time to it's time to stop spreading out so much. And it's time to, close in and be a tight family unit. Elvis accepted fatherhood with a great deal of joy, but the fact that I was a mother had a disquieting effect on him. See why I wanted to read this? There's even more. I didn't understand at the time, but later on, I would learn more about men who were very close to their own mothers. I am no purveyor of Freudian theory. I believe when a man comes into the world, his first unconditional love is his mother. She cuddles him, gives him warmth, the breast for nourishment, and everything he needs to exist. None of those feelings has a sexual connotation. Later, when his own wife becomes a mother, this bank of memories is ripped open and his passion may dissipate. When Elvis's mother was alive, they had been unusually close. Elvis even told her about his amatory adventures, and many nights when she was ill, he would sleep with her. All the girls he took out seriously had to fulfill Gladys's requirements of the ideal woman. And as with me, Elvis then put the girl on a pedestal, saving her until the time was sacred and right. He had his wild times, his flings, but any girl he came home to, he had to respect. Now, I was a mother, and he was uncertain how to treat me. He had mentioned before we were married that he had never been able to make love to a woman who'd had a child. But throughout my pregnancy, until the last 6 weeks, we had made love passionately. He'd been very careful each time, afraid that he might hurt the baby or me, but he was always loving and sensitive to my needs. Now, months had passed. On April 20th, I wrote in my diary, I embarrassed myself last night. I wore a black negligee, laid as close to Elvis as I could while he read. I guess it was because I knew what I wanted and was making it obvious. I kissed his hand, then each finger, then his neck and face. But I waited too long. His sleeping pills had taken effect. Another lonely night. Finally, months later, Elvis made love to me. Before we made love, he told me I was a young mother now, that being the mother of his child is very special. But I wrote in my diary, I am beginning to doubt my own sexuality as a woman. My physical and emotional needs were unfulfilled. And that's it for the word embarrassed. I just checked how many times the word drug shows up in the book. I expected a ton, and there's only 5, and they all look pretty significant and worth talking about. So next time, in the next segment of Priscilla Presley Bingo, that's what we'll talk about. Now let's hop to something else. Let's do a couple rounds of people treating Elvis like dog shit in interviews. because it's also their way of treating young people like dog shit and treating rock and roll like dog shit. The same night, evidently, as he was on that really embarrassing Steve Allen show appearance where they made him wear a tux and tails and sing to a basset hound. And then they followed that up with a skit called Range Roundup with Big Steve and the gang, with like Big Steve Allen carrying a toy guitar and Andy Griffith playing a fiddle and wearing furry chaps. And Elvis was saddled with the name of Tumbleweed. And Steve Allen singing one of those, cowboy movie type singer kind of tunes. I got a horse and I got a gun and I'm going to go out and have some fun. I'm warning you galoots, don't step on my blue suede boots. Yeah. Yippee-I-O, yippee-I-yay, yippee-I-O-I-yay. On his way back to his dressing room, he's intercepted by a rep from the William Morris Talent Agency who says he did a great job and they should be getting a great reaction from this show. Then he goes back to the Warwick Hotel and still has to answer to the public. There was an arrangement through the Herald Tribune's columnist Hy Gardner. It's called Hy Gardner Calling, which was broadcast locally on WRCA TV Channel 4. And the idea was that both parties on either end of the phone line would be filmed as if they were at home on the phone talking casually with like a split screen sort of setup with them. So this is being broadcast live, supposedly, at 11 p.m., and it had to have been one of the more awkward interviews conducted in this format for Mr. Hy Gardner because he was incredibly, I don't have to describe it. I'll just read it. Elvis comes across, you can find the footage of it on YouTube. Elvis definitely comes across as weary and like he's fed up and he's not putting any energy into it and he's not going to dignify this really mean-spirited, bad faith kind of interrogation with any of his usual sort of friendliness or politeness. He was first asked if he was getting enough sleep because he's got sort of a heavy look to his eyes. No, not really, but I'm used to it and I can't sleep any longer. What would go through his mind to keep him awake? Some of the songs he was going to do, or some of your plans, or what? Well, everything has happened to me so fast during the last year and a half. I'm all mixed up, I can't keep up with everything that's happened. Gardner then asked him about some of the criticism that's been directed towards Elvis. Does he feel animosity towards his critics? Well, not really. Those people have a job to do, and they do it. Then he asked him, have you learned anything from the criticism that you've been getting in the press? Elvis says, no, I haven't. You haven't, huh? Because I don't feel like I'm doing anything wrong. He would say, I don't see how any type of music would have any bad influence on people when it's only music. I mean, how would rock and roll music make anyone rebel against their parents? And Hy Gardner would sort of round up the end of the interview with some advice, I guess, suggesting that, bad publicity might have helped him out. And it's made it possible for you to do the kind of things for your folks that you always wanted to. So I sort of think I look at it that way, Elvis. I don't know what that means. Bad publicity? Shitty interviewers? I don't know. Elvis would respond with, well, sir, I tell you, you got to accept the bad along with the good. I've been getting some very good publicity and the press has been real wonderful to me. And I've been getting some bad publicity, but you got to expect that. I know that I'm doing the best I can and I've never turned down a reporter. I've never turned a disc jockey down because they're the people that help make you in this business, as long as I know that I'm doing the best I can. Well, you can't be expected to do any more, says Gardner reassuringly. I want to tell you that it's been just swell talking to you and that you make a lot of sense. It's so just patronizing. And I think he's being earnest. I think the guy was like, yep, I've decided as an adult that you're a sense-making young man. And I want everyone to know that. It's just so reminiscent of every time you've heard those racist examples of saying, well, he was very articulate, this young black man, Now I want to pull from an interview in late summer of 1956 in Tampa, while this interviewer has decided to start the interview with Elvis by just reading out loud some really mean-spirited criticism of him when he's got shows in Lakeland, St. Petersburg, and Orlando, but he's using Tampa as his home base, for the first few shows. This is a backstage interview with Paul Wilder for TV Guide, of all things. He had been with that paper for years, says the text from Peter Gorelnik. So I guess TV Guide is a paper, not a small grocery store magazine that some of us are used to seeing, or when it was a thing, we used to see it in that format. He actually covered Tom Parker on a regular basis in his column In Our Town when the Colonel was Tampa's animal control officer at that time. So Wilder starts by reading these notes. The biggest freak in show business history, from Herb Rau's column in the Miami News. Elvis can't sing, can't play guitar, and he can't dance. He has 2,000 idiots per show, yet every time he opens his mouth, plucks a guitar string, or shakes his pelvis like any striptease babe in town. And that's when Wilder stops reading from the text and looks to Elvis and says, "Do you shake your pelvis like any striptease babe in town?" Understandably, Elvis gets kind of pissed off, and he says, the writer would have to know more about striptease babes since he clearly must be hanging out around them, and also protests the insult to his own audience. He said, "Sir, those kids that come here and pay their money to see this show come to have a good time. I mean, I'm not running Mr. Rao down, but I just don't see that he could call those people idiots, because they're somebody's kids. They're somebody's decent kids, probably that was raised in a decent home, and he hasn't got any right to call those kids idiots. If they want to pay their money to come out and jump around and scream and yell, it's their business. They'll grow up someday and grow out of that. While they're young, let them have their fun. Don't let some old man that's so old he can't get around sit around and call them a bunch of idiots, because they're just human beings like he is." Then Wilder moved on to the comment that Rao made that about how Elvis's female fans really need a solid slap across the mouth. Have you any comment to that? "Yeah, but I don't think that I should say it." Okay, this isn't over the air. This is for TV Guide. Elvis still didn't really think he would want to register his natural reaction to that comment. "Because I'm a singer, not a fighter," which prompted some laughter from people around them. He was asked, what about all this talk about his gyrations? Wilder says, "I read a clipping somewhere you were attributed as saying that holy roller. I have never used that expression." Elvis explodes angrily. "That's another deal. See, I belong to an Assembly of God church, which is a holiness church. I was raised up in a little Assembly of God church, and some character called them holy rollers." "Oh, I see. Well, and that's where that got started. I always attended church where people stood up and sang in the choir and worshiped God, I have never used the expression holy roller." "What about the music in his church?" Wilder wondered innocently enough. "Do you think you transfer some of that rhythm into your..." And here Elvis cuts him off, saying, "That's not it. That's not it at all. There was some article came out where I got the jumping around from my religion. Well, my religion has nothing to do with what I do now, because the type of stuff I do now is not religious music, and my religious background has nothing to do with the way I sing." Now, let's talk about the FBI. FBI has many files on Mr. Presley, all of which can be accessed easily on archive.org, and I'll include a link to that in the description of this episode, because it's got like 12 different PDF scanned uploads, and each of those is many, many pages. Well, like the one I'm looking at now, is 31 pages long. I'm not going to check them all. But I just, flipped around on a couple of them. And what little I've read so far is already interesting. This one's from 3rd February 1960. Memorandum. 1. Elvis Presley was interviewed on 28 December 1959 concerning his complaint that he was the victim of blackmail by a Mr. Lauren Johannes Grisel Landau. And the Grisel Landau is in all caps. Of Johannesburg, South Africa. Grisel Landau represents himself to be a doctor specialist in the field of dermatology. Grisel Landau is not, underlined, not a medical doctor. 2. Copies of letters from Grisel Landau to Presley and Presley's private secretary were obtained on loan basis so that they could be photographed. 3. On or about 27 November 1959, Grisel Landau appeared at the residence of Elvis Presley in I can't read it, Mannheim, Germany. It's very blurry. Well, it's not blurry. It's like old, it's old typewritten pages, so some of the ink gets a little funky looking. And began his treatments. These treatments took place in Presley's quarters in the presence of 2 female secretaries, both U.S. The treatment involved Presley's shoulders and face. Presley reports that the Grisel Landau made several homosexual advances to some of his enlisted friends. Grisel Landau also is alleged to have admitted to Presley that he is bisexual. His first homosexual experiences took place early in his life in the orphanage in which he was brought up. Sorry, that was item number 4. Item number 5, on 24 December 1959, so, Christmas Eve, Presley decided to discontinue the skin treatments. At the time that he told Grisel Landau of his decision, he also thoroughly censured Grisel Landau for embarrassing him as the result of the improper advance that he, Grisel Landau, made to his Presley's enlisted friends. Grisel Landau immediately went into a fit of rage, tore up a photo album of Presley's, and threatened to ruin his singing career and to involve Presley's American girlfriend, a 16-year-old daughter of an Air Force captain. Grisel Landau further threatened to expose Presley by photographs and tape recordings which are alleged to present Presley in compromising situations. Presley assures us that this is impossible since he never was in any compromising situations. Presley contends that Grisel Landau is mentally disturbed. This is based on the fits Grisel Landau has had and on his statements concerning the shock treatments he has been taking. Number 6. By negotiation, Presley agreed to pay Grisel Landau $200 for treatments received and also to furnish him with a $315 plane fare to London, England. Grisel Landau agreed to depart to England on 25 December 1959 at 1930 hours from Frankfurt, Germany. Grisel Landau did not leave as agreed, rather returned and demanded an additional $250, which Presley paid. A day later, Grisel Landau made a telephonic demand for £2,000 for the loss of his practice, which he closed in Johannesburg, South Africa. Sorry if it's Johannesburg. I don't fucking know. Johannesburg, South Africa, prior to his departure for Bad Nauheim to treat Presley. Next page, item number 7, the last one. Grisel Landau finally departed Rhein-Main Airfield, Frankfurt, Germany at 1600 hours, 6 January 1960 on flight 491. Oh, so he hung around for a 10-day total. British European Airway for London, England under the name of Grisel. He is alleged to be seeking entry into the United... I can't read that. It looks like it says... States. No contact between Presley and Grisel Landau has been reported since 5 January. And the pages following are a handwritten letter, it looks like from Mr. Landau. A little hard to read, but you could do it if you wanted to. Also in these files, there's the following. January 29, 1972, from President Richard M. Nixon, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, Washington, D.C. Dear Sir, I had recently read in the newspaper that you had arranged for Elvis Presley, who is a police buff, to receive a federal narcotics badge. I, too, am a police buff. I collect badges and join and support many police associations, besides also being a special deputy sheriff. I know you cannot issue a federal narcotics badge to everyone who wants one, but I'm interested whether there are any federal law enforcement departments that I may be able to be made an honorary or associate member or something of that nature. I would appreciate any help you or your office may be able to give. Now, dig this memorandum from the 4th of January, 1971, to Mr. Bishop from, I can't read that. Subject, Elvis Presley, William and Morris, former sheriff, Shelby County, Tennessee, Bureau Tour 12/31/70. Presley and Morris and 6 individuals who provide security for Presley visited FBI headquarters and were afforded a very special tour of our facilities in accordance with plans approved by the director. Regrets were expressed to Presley and his party in connection with their request to meet the director. Presley indicated that he had long been an admirer of Mr. Hoover and has read material prepared by the director, including Masters of Deceit, A Study of Communism, as well as J. Edgar Hoover on Communism. Presley noted that, in his opinion, no one has ever done as much for his country as Mr. Hoover, and that he, Presley, considers the director the greatest living American. He also spoke most favorably of the Bureau. I'm going to miss a couple of words here because it's kind of blotted out. But despite his rather bizarre personal appearance, Presley seemed a sincere, serious-minded individual who expressed concern over some of the problems confronting our country, particularly those involving young people. In this regard, in private comments made following his tour, he indicated that he, Presley, the living proof that America is the land of opportunity, since he rose from a truck driver to prominent entertainer almost overnight. He said that he spends as much time as his schedule permits informally talking to young people. Just what they consider to be their problems with him. Discussing their problems with him, I guess. Presley, long hair and unusual apparel are merely tools of his trade, and success and rapport with many people, particularly on college campuses who consider themselves anti-establishment, in quotes. Presley said that while he has a limited education, he has been able to command a certain amount of respect and attention from this segment of the population, and in an informal way point out the errors of their ways. He advised that he does not consider himself competent to address large groups, but much rather prefers small gatherings in community centers and the like, where he makes himself accessible for talks and discussions regarding the evils of narcotics and other problems of concern to teenagers and other young people. Following their tour, Presley privately advised that he has volunteered his services to the president in connection with the narcotics problem, and that Mr. Nixon has responded by furnishing him an agent's badge of the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. Presley was carrying this badge in his pocket and displayed it. Presley advised that he wished the director to be aware that he, Presley, from time to time is approached by individuals and groups in and outside of the entertainment business whose motives and goals he is convinced are not in the best interests of this country, and who seek to have him lend his name to their questionable activities. In this regard, he volunteered to make such information available to the Bureau on a confidential basis whenever it came to his attention. He further indicated that he wanted the director to know that should the Bureau ever have need of his services in any way, he would be delighted to be of assistance. Presley indicated that he is of the opinion that the Beatles laid their groundwork for many of the problems we are having with young people by their filthy, unkempt appearances and suggestive music while entertaining in this country during the early and middle 1960s. He advised that the Smothers Brothers, Jane Fonda, and other persons in the entertainment industry of their ilk have a lot to answer for in the hereafter for the way they have poisoned young minds by disparaging the United States in their public statements and unsavory activities. Presley advised that he resides at 3764 Highway 51, South Memphis, Tennessee, but that he spends a substantial portion of his time in Beverly Hills, California, Los Angeles, Nevada, areas fulfilling motion picture assignments and singing commitments. He noted that he can be contacted anytime through his Memphis address, and that because of problems he has with people tampering with his mail, such correspondence should be addressed to him under the pseudonym redacted. And then it sort of wraps up with the note about the William Morris guy saying Presley was a clean-minded individual despite his outlandish appearance. And then the observation that Presley did give the impression of being a sincere young man who is conscious of the many problems confronting this country. And thus they approve the creation of a letter to Elvis Presley from the director. I also wanted to note, while we're talking about government agencies and Elvis Presley, as we all know, he was drafted and around the end of 1957, he was kind of riding on a deferment for his service because he was still had an obligation to finish the filming of the movie Kid Creole. And during that time, about 10 days before Christmas, actually, he started getting serious pitches from the Army, Navy, and Air Force about what they could do for him. Suggestions like an Elvis Presley company in the Navy that could be specially trained, or an Air Force deal where he would merely tour recruiting centers around the country. But after he and the colonel talked about it, it was decided that there would probably be a vicious public backlash if he didn't go into the Army and receive the same treatment as any other citizen would. I also wanted to mention his reaction when asked and prompted to read a quote from Frank Sinatra. This would have been around late 57. Rock and roll smells phony and false, declared Frank Sinatra. It is sung, played, and written for the most part by cretinous goons and by means of almost imbecilic reiteration and sly, lewd, in plain fact, dirty lyrics. It manages to be the marital music of every sideburns delinquent on the face of the earth. This text says martial. I originally, in another book, I read it as marital. I'm not sure what would be more accurate, but I think marital would be the implication of, getting it on. And his response, I admire the man. He has a right to say what he wants to say. He is a great success and a fine actor. But I think he shouldn't have said it. He's mistaken about this. This is a trend just the same as he faced when he started years ago. I consider it the greatest in music. It's very noteworthy, and namely because it is the only thing I can do. And the reporter said, "Is that all you have to say? You can't knock success." And then the reporter proceeded to ask him questions about his income, his sideburns, his draft status, and any plans he might have for marriage. Before he took the stage, let's see, I think we're talking, the Pan Pacific Auditorium in Hollywood, his debut in Hollywood, October 28th of that year. And a longtime critic of his, Mr. Jack O'Brien of the New York Journal-American, declared that on stage he wiggled, bumped, and twisted in a manner that was far too indecent to mention in every detail. Of course, the audience went crazy, but newspapers took... well, they were acting like narcs, basically. They said, Elvis Presley will have to clean up his show or go to jail. O'Brien would go on to characterize the music as a terrible popular twist on darkest Africa's fertility tom-tom displays. And the LA Mirror News would say, if any further proof were needed that what Elvis offers is not basically music but a sex show, it was proved last night. His performance resembled one of those screeching, uninhibited party rallies which the Nazis used to hold for Hitler. There were a lot of parents who attended with their kids, including actors Alan Ladd and Walter Slezak, who expressed outrage to authorities and newspapers. The result was that the LA Vice Squad contacted Colonel Tom Parker, who then told Elvis that he would have to cut out some of the dancing in general, tone down the act and his own physicality. Elvis's reaction, the colonel said, "This isn't the first time. They've done it a couple times before." Did Elvis complain about not being able to dance? No, he didn't complain. He just said, well, if I don't dance tonight, maybe I don't have to take a shower tonight. Then Elvis, when asked about that comment, said, Colonel Parker said that? He shouldn't have. You see, I take a shower every night, whether I dance or just sing. He was upset. So the next night, the cops come in with movie cameras because they have to film this all for evidence. They're ready to just pounce on him and have it on film in court if they decide they need to lock up Elvis Presley for dancing on stage the way he does. The only vocal opponent to the toned-down version that was a notable Hollywood celebrity on this night was the actor Yul Brynner, whose bleeding heart, wrote Jack O'Brien, led him to protest the censorship as if it were an invasion of someone's privacy. Yeah, that's exactly what it is, O'Brien. It's about bodily autonomy. I mostly wanted to include that for two reasons. One, the Frank Sinatra quote, which I have kept near and dear to my heart ever since I read it in the introduction to Classic Guitars of the 50s, a book that I bought in 2000. And back in the days when we had email signatures that were movie quotes or whatever, that was my quote. Then the other thing is just to point out that if you think it was all like backwards redneck Southerners in America that were, or as we've read in a previous episode, Canadians that were disgusted at rock and roll and disgusted at Elvis Presley's performances, and also just flat out outraged and willing to bring legal action against it. That was not the case. Even in Hollywood, California, it was getting that kind of blowback. Jumping ahead in the timeline, let's get back to Elvis, What Happened, which is a book written by three members of his close Memphis Mafia crew, as told to another author or author-editor. So it's Steve Dunleavy, Red West, Sonny West, and Dave Hebler. At the beginning of one of the chapters, there's an explanation that Elvis had a real problem with one of their crew because he cursed too much. Now, the guys cursed a lot, and Elvis cursed too. But they realized it was specifically because this guy's go-to phrase was son of a bitch. Elvis was intensely triggered by that word, and that is the language used in this book from 1977. It was a triggering word for him. That's not a new catchphrase. People derisively use it now as sort of a joke against folks that are sensitive about certain things. But, being triggered's been a thing for a long time. And that's because, in Elvis's case, of his reverence for his mother. As Sonny or Red, I forget which one it is, points out, he believes Elvis loved two people in his entire life, and that's Priscilla and Gladys. At this point, he's lost both of them, I'm pretty sure. And there's a young woman by the name of Judy hanging around one particular night. It's a little celebration, a little impromptu open house kind of a party to, commemorate the fact that the final filming of Fun in Acapulco was over, and everybody's winding down. The quotes I'll start reading here. I was at the International House of Pancakes down on the Strip, and I picked up on these two pretty girls. One of the girls later became quite a well-known actress, and the other one, let's call her Judy, which is not her real name, was a sweet little thing. I think she's probably married now, so I don't want to embarrass her by identifying her. Anyway, I took them up to the house, and there's a whole thing going on up there. Depending on what sort of mood he is in, Elvis, on one of these nights, might just say hello to everybody, that's spelled Hullo, and go straight to bed. Other nights, he wouldn't come down at all. This is Sonny West telling the story, by the way. But if he was looking around for a little action, he would sweet-talk some gal for a while, and then take her upstairs for some action. Yeah, I could have edited that, couldn't we? That could have been said without the same phrase twice. Jesus. On this night, Elvis didn't seem to be doing any of those things. He was pretty tired and seemed a bit agitated. I walked in and gave him a big hello. He wanted... I always think of Winnie the Pooh when I read it written that way. It's like they don't even put quotes in it, around it, or they don't put it in italics. It just says Hullo. Hello, Piglet. What are you doing today? He wanted me to play pool with him. Now I had these ladies with me. But when Elvis wants you to do something, you do it. So I left these two little gals to all the other vultures up there, and I started to play pool with Elvis. After a while, we started playing forehand pool with two other guys at the party. Elvis's mood was not being helped by the fact that he was muffing about every second shot. As in all these cases, I got a bit tense, knowing that Elvis can flash in these situations. What made me more worried was the fact that there were a lot of people there, lots of chicks, and I was scared he would do something in front of them all. Around this time, Judy, I guess, has gotten bored with the whole party. The man she came in with, of course, Sonny, was now too busy playing pool to take any notice of her, and she wanted to leave. So Sonny says, anyway, Elvis is just about to hit a shot, and little old Judy comes down the steps into the games room. She calls to him. I think I better be leaving now, Sonny. Could you move your car, please? It's blocking mine, and I can't get out. And Sonny says, yep, hon, just a minute. Elvis slowly rises up from the table where he is about to shoot his ball. And Elvis, I guess, says, Sonny, what in the hell does she want? Sonny's like, nothing, boss. She just wants me to move my car so she can get out. Elvis is like, whoa there. Hell, man, you're playing pool. Let her get someone else to move the damn car. Judy gets embarrassed. She'd never met Elvis. And, of course, she's an admirer of his, and that's probably why she was lured to this party in the first place. And she says, look, I'm sorry. I just don't know anyone else here. That's why I asked Sonny. And Sonny, if you just move it, I'll leave. I'm sorry to bother you. The author notes she looked like she wanted to jump in a hole somewhere. Elvis Presley's eyes narrowed. He pulled himself upright and his lips curled back. Sonny knew the signs. God damn it, Elvis yelled. God damn it. Didn't you hear what I said? Get someone else to move it. So she goes, go to hell, you son of a bitch. That did it. It happened very fast, apparently. He took that pool cue in his fist, Sonny recalls. Then, like he was throwing a spear, he just leaned back and threw it right at her across the pool table. She had no time to duck. The sharp end of the pool cue bored right into her body. It hit her just above the nipple of the left breast. God, she didn't scream. It was more like a sharp little gasp, and she crumpled backwards on the floor. Sonny dashed around the table to where Judy lay on the ground. Judy, you okay, hun? Sonny was worried. She was very pale, and she was lying there sobbing very quietly. Her face was whiter than vanilla ice cream. I was scared something bad had happened. It was a hell of a blow. Sonny yelled out and asked Judy whether she was all right. Elvis picks up another pool cue and replied, hell yes, she's all right. It was just one of those dramatic falls. Drag her ass out of here. Sonny picks up the quietly sobbing Judy in his arms, carried her up the stairs to the upper level of the den, and laid her gently on a couch. I mean, according to Sonny. This is the editor or the author's framing of this all, of course, but we can't, he wasn't there, so I don't know. A hush falls over the party. Everybody's embarrassed. Sonny says she's hurting. Her face is all screwed up with pain, and she was sobbing. Jesus, I felt awful. And this is like while Elvis is calling for Sonny to get back to playing pool with him. And he's trying to calm this girl down, even though she's hurt and she's pissed off, and he doesn't blame her. She looked up at Sonny and repeated, that son of a bitch. Why did he do that? I never did anything to him. He needn't have done that. She was holding her breast and sobbing. Gee, hon, said Sonny, I'm sorry that happened. I know he didn't mean it. It was just one of those reaction things. You know, it was temper. He didn't mean it. It's going to be all right. He's covering for Elvis for what he thinks is a particularly brutal act in this case. And if any other man had done it in Sonny's presence, he admits he would have dismembered him. Then she starts talking about suing Elvis. And that worries Sonny just a little bit because she has every right to do so. And he tells her not to be silly. She should forget about it. And she's in his house, and she did insult him, and there were a lot of his friends around as witnesses. And then I said, who do you think they're going to stand up for? Judy doesn't care. She's going to sue him because he deserves it, she says. So, even though he wouldn't have blamed her for it, he says, but I was so locked into Elvis, it was second nature for me to stand up for him, even when I knew he was very wrong. We had all brainwashed ourselves into that way of thinking. Judy leaves. She never did file a suit. Sonny goes back to the den after she was gone. He gets back to the pool table, and Elvis is now exhibiting some signs of guilt, trying to justify his actions. No way would he have said he was wrong, though, according to Sonny. Look, Sonny, he said, if she had hit me or called me a bastard or told me to go fuck myself, it would have been okay. And Sonny replied, hey, man, that little girl is hurting. There was no need to do that. She just wanted me to move the damn car. Elvis was insistent that he had a right to do what he did. Then he said sheepishly, well, man, she shouldn't have called me a son of a bitch. That ain't right. It's all because he was incredibly sensitive about his mother. The author notes that doctors report a particularly severe blow in the sensitive region of the breast can trigger a mass of ailments. A tumor reaction, a cyst, or a blood clot. Soon after the pool cue incident, Sonny bumped into Judy on that strip in Hollywood. She was still very annoyed at what had happened. I apologized to her because it was a bad deal, and I quite liked her. Meh. I felt responsible because I brought her to the place. Anyway, I don't know whether it's true or not, but she told me that the pool cue had damaged some nerves in the left breast. The nipple of her left breast had dropped lower than the right breast nipple. Damn, that made me angry. She was a pretty little thing with a cute figure. Son of a bitch, that made me angry. Now let's talk about another incident with a young lady that was procured for Elvis by Sonny. In this case, a young lady named Jane, who was up near the front row, I think, of one of the shows Elvis is putting on. And, Sonny sees him afterwards, after he gets off stage, and says he put on a great show. He really turned him on. But Elvis's first piece of communication is, God damn, man, do you see that gal sitting there in the front of the audience? Hell, that was some good-looking piece of woman. Who is she? She was beautiful. Sonny and Joe were not surprised that he had noticed her in particular. The text says, it's almost impossible normally to see an audience from a spotlit stage, but when Elvis had gone to the edge to throw out his scarves, he had been able to see the first 3 or 4 rows. And Sonny says, yep, I know the one you're talking about. She's a real honey. He dashes upstairs as the dinner crowd is still recovering from their hysteria and zeroes in on one Jane Robertson, at least according to this book. I'm not sure if that's a fake name or not. It probably said so at the beginning of the chapter. You can read the book and find out. So he asks her, hi, hun, do you want to meet Elvis? I'm Sonny West, and I work security. I'd be happy to introduce you to him. And she said, oh, come on. You're kidding me. And says, nope, hun, here's my identification. I work for Mr. Presley. I would be happy to introduce you. Come on, he's upstairs in his room. I'll take you all right on up. So he's in his inner dressing room changing. So Sonny introduces her around to everyone that's present. She has some small talk with Sonny and Joe and how much she enjoyed the performance and that she's been an Elvis fan ever since she could remember being able to listen to music. And she's laughing and giggling with everyone and being kind of shy. Elvis materializes from the inner dressing room, and Sonny thought Jane was going to collapse. She had this great laugh, a beautifully shy personality. Boy, she was a looker. When meeting a new girl, Elvis very rarely changes his line. He comes on very quiet, very attentive, very considerate. He turns on the little old country boy act like a tap, and the girls fall down like oaks. Even if Elvis wasn't who he was, say he was just an old truck driver, says Sonny, when he turns on that country boy charm, he could romance the Queen of England. Jane ends up staying in Elvis's suite that night. Her mother would make the trip home alone after the show. Elvis really dug her, says Sonny. He saw a lot of her during that engagement. Bought her some clothes and stuff. Not that she wanted them, she just wanted to be close to Elvis. But in a short while, Jane began to change in an ever so small way. Elvis started to give her a couple of pills here and there to give her a lift. Not that she needed it, but I guess she just didn't want to look like a hick or a square. And I know she never had taken anything before, said Sonny. The night Sonny would like to forget, Elvis, Sonny, and Charlie Hodge took Jane on a trip to the Presley home in Chino Canyon Road, Palm Springs. When they got there, Elvis was feeling like getting out of it. He had taken his usual dose of pills during the day, but as bedtime came around, about 3 a.m, Elvis produced a bottle of prescription Vicodin, normally prescribed by doctors for severe cases of coughing and congestion. Vicodin in large doses is a dangerous narcotic. Elvis would get out of his gourd on that stuff, Sonny recalls. I've tasted it. Yuck. That night, Jane took a little swig. More giggles. Toward 4 a.m., the two of them were nodding off, giggling, stumbling, and slurring their words in happy unison. Then they went to bed. This continues with them drinking the Haikidan, and then they were in the master bedroom for the rest of the night, laughing it up. And in the morning, Sonny had planned to drag Elvis outside to get in some sun. He was awful white looking, so we wanted him to get a tan to make himself look healthier. The entourage wakes up 11 a.m. Sonny and Charlie reading the paper, waiting for boss man to get up and come out of his bedroom. Noon comes and goes, and normally someone would have taken up his breakfast by that point, but this day they didn't, and it's now getting close to 1 o'clock. He casually asks whether anyone has checked on Elvis. The point is that the fear of him taking an overdose is never far from our minds, although he is very skillful when it comes to measuring out drugs. He knows those drugs better than a doctor. But on this morning, he had miscalculated. Sonny wandered back to the master bedroom to check. He went through the first door and then banged on the second door, which opened into the main suite. You getting up, boss? What do you want for breakfast? I'll fix it. Hey, Elvis, boss, you there? No answer. He opens the door. Elvis is sprawled across the bed sideways. Inside the bedroom, he says the temperature is way down. It's freezing. He would keep that room temperature down so low you could hardly stand it. I dashed over to Elvis. Boss, 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 come on, snap out of it. Boss, boss. Sonny starts screaming at him. He recalls Elvis taking long, deep breaths about 5 seconds apart. Sonny crawls across the bed to where Jane was laying naked under the bed covers. Jane, hon, come on, let's get up. Come on. Oh, man, that was it. The whole trip was over. I was sure that they had both bought it. I opened Jane's eyes, and they were staring straight ahead like glass marbles. And there was a terrible gasp. She wasn't breathing properly. It was like a long, strangled, half-groan, half-gasp. I then opened her eyelids again, and they were blank. I slapped her across the face hard a couple times, but no reaction. Christ, I was scared. I yelled out to Charlie Hodge, Charlie, you better get a doctor here real quick. Elvis and his gal here are out of it real bad. Within minutes, a doctor whom we will call X, says the book, arrived at the house on Chino Canyon Road. By this time, Elvis had started to come around. Dr. X took one look at the girl. I wonder if this is Dr. Nick. He's named repeatedly in the official texts by Peter Gorelnik and lots of other people in articles and stuff. He was the Dr. Feelgood towards the end of Elvis's life. I mean, he had for a long time, not just at the end, but he's the guy that had to talk to the cops for sure. Let's see. He took one look at the girl, checked her pulse and her breathing and her eyes, and said, we've got to get an ambulance up here. This girl is dying. We can't waste any time. Elvis is staggering around like a drunken sailor at this point, telling the doctor, come on, doc, she'll be okay. Just give her a shot of Ritalin. I'm telling you, she'll be okay. Sonny's getting exasperated. They had a girl dying on their hands, and Elvis is telling the doctor what to do. Man, I was hot. I could have smacked him right in the mouth. Damn fool telling the doctor his business. Elvis continues arguing with the doctor, who's getting more and more concerned, and explains it's just too much Haikidan. That's all. She was drinking the damn stuff like water. Just give her a shot of Ritalin and she's going to be okay. Doctor cuts him short. No, we're getting her in an ambulance and straight to emergency. Ambulance shows up in a couple of minutes. Charlie Hodge and Sonny follow the ambulance to the hospital. They pumped her stomach, hook her up to machines and everything for monitoring, and they're seriously concerned she's not going to make it. And the doctor comes over to them and says, this girl is in bad shape. I'll be honest, I can't promise anything. Why don't you go back to the house and I will call you if there's any change. So Sonny and Charlie go back to Elvis's place and had started popping some Ritalin, asking if she had improved at all, and they said no. Told him the doctor doesn't know if she's going to live or die. Elvis said, I told that girl not to drink that much. She was whacked. He then went into the bedroom to make an important telephone call. Sonny's getting angry about this. Says, I don't care how he cuts it. It was his bottle of drugs. That little girl had never even touched a glass of champagne. And now, because of him, she's battling for her life in the hospital. And all he can do is tell the doctor what to do and then tell us it's all her fault. God damn, he's a son of a bitch. Brave words from a man who's no longer employed by Elvis Presley. Eventually, they get a phone call from Dr. X, and Charlie and Sonny go back to the hospital to see the girl in the intensive care unit. She's looking like she's going to be okay to a certain degree, but the doctor really doesn't know how long a time there was that she might have, like her brain might have been deprived of oxygen or something like that. So he goes over to the girl and touched her arm and said her name softly. Apparently, she opened her eyes and came off that bed like a wild animal. She was hissing like a goddamn mountain lion, snarling like a wild beast. Doctor explained to him that she doesn't know where she is, and we don't know if she's going to be okay. But, you know, they're at least relieved that she's not going to be in a vegetative state for the rest of her natural life. Now, the next person to get involved is whoever was on the other end of the line when Elvis made his phone call. Elvis apparently was not worried about anything when the guys, you know, talked to him after this little encounter with Jane. He seemed to be calm because of whatever was happening with the other guy. They said it's someone that Elvis always turned to when he got involved in something he couldn't handle. The hospital bill was paid for. She was flown back home. There wasn't a whisper about it in the press. The newspapers would have had a party with that one. Later on, someone brought up the fact that there might be a lawsuit brought by the girl or her mother. Joe Esposito was instructed to give her some money. The mother, bless her, wouldn't accept it. I think Joe ended up giving them something. But the girl and the mother didn't want anything. They didn't sue or anything like that. They were real great people. The point was, because Elvis had this image of being so anti-drug, the girl and the mother didn't want to destroy that image. That girl, Jane, she loved Elvis, man. Do you know, I believe that even if her daughter had died, the mother still would have kept her mouth shut. And much like the last story, supposedly Sonny sees the girl again a little further down the road. She and her mother had driven to Las Vegas to catch more Elvis shows. He met her mother then. They were sleeping in their car because they couldn't afford a room in the hotel. Joe Esposito found out about it, picked up the tab, and then put them up in a guest room at the Hilton. When I spoke to her, she had tears in her eyes. Sonny, don't you know I don't hold anything against him? He didn't do anything. It was all my fault. There she was, taking the rap for the whole thing. He did get her to drink it. He was the king. Anyone would do anything to please him. Man, it was all over for that little girl. Her face never lit up anymore. Whatever happened back there to her when she overdosed, it had affected her whole personality. She was a different person. There wasn't that shy giggle, that easy laugh anymore. She seemed to be deep and quiet and introverted. I'm no doctor, but that experience just turned her completely around. And yet all she could talk about was Elvis. There was a genuine love there. And about Elvis, he said he never heard Elvis talk about her again. By 1971, he was a changed guy. He was no longer the shy, fun-loving kid from Memphis. No, he was just living for himself and all that damn junk he took. He was like a walking drugstore. All right, friends, it's once again time for another round of Priscilla Presley Bingo. That's a bingo. We just say bingo. Ah, bingo. Let's see. First appearance of the word drug in her book is, surprisingly, as far along as page 192. She talks about Joe Esposito, who was one of Elvis's closest, trustees, confidants, people that he trusted. And she's sort of setting up this relationship to the reader as, you know, the Colonel is the one who tells Joe that Elvis is a problem. He doesn't go to Elvis at this point in the relationship, whenever this is. When the Colonel made Joe responsible, pardon me. She actually doesn't write the Colonel. She writes when Colonel Maybe she also knows he didn't actually achieve the rank of colonel. So that's just a proper name. When Colonel made Joe responsible for reporting to him on Elvis's, quote, mental and emotional state, unquote, a euphemistic phrase for drug use, Elvis found out and said, I don't want any sons of bitches here telling Colonel what I do or what goes on in this household. He fired Joe on the spot. 6 months later, he forgave him and took him back. It was typical of Elvis to blow off steam and then forgive all. We see that in the movie. We see that in the John Carpenter film, where towards the end he's just hanging out with the gang around the patio and stuff, and somebody in the crew says something he doesn't like, and he gets pissed off and fires the guy, and then makes a big deal of getting him back and apologizing, stuff like that. It only sort of happens once. There's a lot of routine behavior that is very off-putting that people around Elvis would report that shows up in like one example in the Dick Clark produced John Carpenter film. So it's weird. It's like it does acknowledge some of that scary stuff, but doesn't tell you why. It doesn't tell you how often it happens. So you just have these little tiny insights or twinges of recognition of Elvis being eccentric, right? Not a serial abuser in that movie. So let's see. After that, the word drug appears about 20 pages later, and let's see what it says. Oh, LSD. Okay. It sounds like Elvis and Priscilla did some acid together. It says, during this period when he was still seeking a higher state of consciousness, we experimented with mind-expanding drugs. We tried marijuana a few times, and neither of us especially liked it. We felt tired and groggy, and we'd become ravenously hungry. After a few raids on the refrigerator and carrying the resulting extra poundage, we decided to stay away from the stuff. Although he abhorred street drugs, he was curious enough to try LSD once. When he initiated our experiment, he made sure Sonny West was on hand at all times to supervise. The night we tried it, Lamar, Jerry, Larry, Elvis, and I took seats around the conference table in Elvis's office upstairs at Graceland. Elvis and I took half a tab. At first, nothing happened. Then we started staring at each other and laughing. Our faces were becoming distorted. I became engrossed in Elvis's multicolored shirt. It started to grow, getting larger and larger until I thought he was going to burst. It was captivating, but I did not like the feeling. I thought, this isn't real. Be careful. You're losing it. I tried to hang on to sanity. We all gathered around the large aquarium outside the master bedroom, fascinated by all the tropical fish. Funny, there were only 2 or 3, but suddenly I saw an ocean of brightly colored fish. I strolled off and found myself in Elvis's huge walk-in closet, purring like a kitten. It was early morning when Elvis and I went downstairs and walked outside. Dew came down, creating rainbows in the mist, glistening on the trees and the lawn. We studied the leaves, trying to count each dewdrop. The veins in the grass became visible, breathing slowly, rhythmically. We went from tree to tree, observing nature in detail. It was an extraordinary experience. However, realizing it was too dangerous a drug to fool around with, we never tried LSD again. Yeah, sounds real dangerous. You went out in the garden and got obsessed with your husband's shirt. I think that's exactly what people should do when they're on LSD, personally. Now, further along on to page 287, she says, Elvis was an avid badge collector. He had detective, police, and sheriff badges from all over the nation. And the narc badge represented some kind of ultimate power in him. In Elvis's mind, that badge would give him the right to carry any prescribed drug he had on his person. So, let's see. Let me back up. Elvis explained who he was. He had a message for the president. Promised the letter would be given to President Nixon at 9 that morning. Elvis then had Jerry arrange for him to see John Finlater, Deputy Narcotics Director in Washington. Elvis truly wanted to help kids get off street drugs. The purpose of Elvis's trip was to try to acquire a federal narcotics badge for himself. Okay, got it. His obsession with obtaining this badge was triggered by a private eye named John O'Grady, whom Elvis had hired to handle a paternity suit. O'Grady showed Elvis his federal narc badge, and Elvis's mind started clicking immediately. How could he get one himself? John O'Grady mentioned that John Finlater was the man Elvis should see. I guess he tries. He has a meeting and is very emotional with Priscilla, saying that he won't let me have the badge. Jerry was able to lift his spirits by telling him he had just received a call from the White House. The president, come on, page turn, read your letter and wants to see you in 20 minutes. Walking into the White House was no easy feat, even for Elvis Presley. The guards were friendly, but cautious as they checked him out. Jerry, too, was searched before entering the Oval Office, along with Sonny West, whom Jerry had called to join them. Sonny had been mystified by the call and was awestruck when he realized he was about to meet the President of the United States. Elvis was led separately in the Oval Office. Jerry and Sonny were told they had to wait outside. Now, I know a bit of this story thanks to Henry Rollins, so I'm curious to read the next part. Though there was some slight chance they'd meet the president later. According to Jerry, they were brought into the Oval Office in less than a minute. Jerry knew that if there was a way to get them in, Elvis would do it, and he had come through. Not even the president was immune to his charm. When Jerry and Sonny entered, they saw that Elvis had made himself right at home. He introduced everyone and encouraged the president to give Jerry and Sonny cufflinks and was not shy in asking for mementos to take home to their wives. By the time he left the Oval Office, he had added this most important badge to his collection. He emerged smiling, a different Elvis from the one who, a few hours before, was emotionally upset. Nixon overruled Finlander's decision and had the badge sent to the Oval Office where he could present it to Elvis. The argument about Colonel that started this escapade was never mentioned again. Oh, we missed that bit. Interesting. If I go back to the beginning of that chapter, she talks about, I found Elvis and Vernon arguing about Colonel Parker. Goddamn, Daddy, call him and tell him we're through. Tear up the goddamn contracts and I'll pay him whatever percentage we owe him. Listen, son, are you sure you want to do this? Goddamn right I am. I hate what I'm doing and I'm goddamn bored. All right, so somehow that doesn't connect to the badge. The badge thing takes his mind off of it. All right. Good to know, though. So the thing that I heard from Henry Rollins on his podcast, Henry and Heidi, was for the research I did for the Jerry Lee Lewis episode, specifically the final episode. If you listen to the first part of that, you'll hear about it. And he's hanging out with. He's going to interview Jerry Lee Lewis in his home, Jerry's home. And I guess it's Sonny, I believe, if I remember right, the member of the Memphis Mafia that is now working for Jerry Lee as a personal bodyguard and assistant in general. And Henry Rollins tells his co-host Heidi, like, this is the guy that was there guarding, like, as Elvis's bodyguard when he went to the White House. When they walked into the Oval Office and they were stopped by the Secret Service, and they were told, hey, you stay out of this doorway. I have to take, I have to watch out for the president. And if I remember right, it was Sonny who said, yeah, but I'm guarding him. And he points to Elvis, and I need half this door. Which Priscilla obviously didn't remember that or didn't think it was important enough to put in her book, but it's a wonderful story. And there is a photograph of Elvis talking to Nixon and both of those guards side by side by the door, by the open door, I guess. Actually, I forget if it's open or closed. It doesn't matter. They're both. There's a Secret Service guy and then there's a member of the Memphis Mafia standing there. Oh, I love you, America. And then let's see. The next drug reference is, no, just the phrase drug pushers. We've already mentioned this. Priscilla brings it up, but the guys brought it up in Elvis What Happened. He has a list of all the drug pushers in Memphis. And then the final mention is in the epilogue. She's just wrapping up. She's like, other books have painted a picture rather less than flattering, harboring on weakness, eccentricities, violent temper tantrums, perversions, and drug abuse. I wanted to write about love and precious, wonderful moments, and ones filled with grief and disappointments, about a man's triumphs and defeats, much of it with a child woman at his side, feeling and experiencing his pain and joys as if they were one. Priscilla seems to me to be a very genuine human being in telling her story from, I've only read, dear listener, the parts of this book that I've read out loud to you. But there's definitely an assistant, an editor, a non-ghostwriter, if you will, Sandra Harmon. So maybe Sandra Harmon took all these personal memories and edited out a lot of opinions and just made her seem a lot more diplomatic and mature in hindsight. That's possible. Or maybe Priscilla Presley is that mature and diplomatic and just told her story as she saw it, right? I think she seems to be, she comes off very admirable, I think, based on these writings. There was a 1988 made-for-TV film you can look for on YouTube. I myself found a version of it on archive.org that was broadcast in Australia. Sorry, Australians. We Americans can't pronounce the name of your country without doing that little thing to the Alia. And it's full of commercial breaks. So if you want to watch it, go to archive.org and look up Elvis and Me and look for the one that says it has commercial breaks built into it. And there's like 5 parts. And you can watch strange commercials for footy bread. I don't know why someone thought that would sound appetizing. But in Australia, it's called footy bread. Because you play football with it, or you eat it, or you eat football, or something. Now, I know there are Australian listeners, or people that download in Australia. Or, the third possibility, as I've mentioned before, is what I'm seeing in the statistics as Australian downloads are actually just a bunch of American perverts who are using what do you call the IP address hiding thing? The VPN. They're using a VPN. Now to wrap up this final installment of Priscilla Presley Bingo, I did look up the phrase passed out, and it shows up twice. The first one is soon after another piece we've already gotten into. It's the New Year's Eve double screwdrivers episode. And she gets taken home by George Klein, the Memphis disc jockey, and has her head out the window most of the ride back to Graceland. George and his date walked me to the door where we said goodnight. I let myself in. Gripping the banister, I slowly climbed the white stairs, shedding my clothing as I went. My jacket, purse, shoes, blouse, left a long trail up the steps. Man, remember those days when you're young and you're getting drunk for the first few times? Hopefully you learned after those. And you're just, you can't even wait to get to your bed to take your clothes off. You're just like dropping garments on your way to the bedroom or possibly to the bathroom. Yeah. Oh, like your whole body's uncomfortable with itself. I'm sure there's like no young people listening to this because it's about Elvis. Or there's not very many, but if you're young and you haven't started drinking, good for you. Maybe don't. Just saying. But if you do and you start getting wasted and you start getting sick more than a few times a year, let it be known. I'm planting this in your psyche, and it's going to ruin you for a long time. When you're so loaded and you're so ill from drinking that you can't exist with clothing on while you're awake and you haven't even made it to bed yet, you are just at the top of a plunge. You are at the top of that first huge peak on a roller coaster, and it's about to be 4 to 8 hours of hell for you right now, because it starts with, I don't want my shoes on, and then it's like, oh, I don't want my socks on, like, and then you like wiggle your toes a bit, and you go, that feels better, but then like your clothes feel weird against your skin, and you start taking stuff off, and then you get down to your underpants, and you're like, well, screw it, I'm already this close to being naked. Then that's when your skin being in contact with garments, your skin has been telling you, stop making me touch garments, and you remove them to make your skin happy. Well, because of the chemicals in your brain and in your blood and a traumatic lack of moisture in your body, your skin is about to get angry at the open air as well. And probably at your bed sheets, and angry at your bed in general, your cushions, your pillows, everything that touches your skin, including the air itself, is making your skin angry, and your muscles are going to be twitching, and you're going to be tossing and turning a lot, unless you just have the glory of passing out and becoming unconscious, which means you're going to wake up within 3 to 8 hours vomiting and you're not going to be comfortable for a long, long time. If you could have taken in any water before you passed out, you'd be much better off. Just saying. Priscilla probably learned that lesson pretty easily, but she didn't even have Elvis with her to carry her through this. She was on her own, unfortunately. By the time I reached the bedroom, I was wearing only my bra and panties. I collapsed on the bed and passed out. There's the words passed out that I was looking for. Now, the next one, I see, okay, there's some house guests that passed out. She says, our last 3 years on Hillcrest, which we'd gradually outgrown. This must be another house that's not Graceland. Lisa Marie Presley, their daughter, and her nurse shared one room. Charlie Hodge brings me my scars and my water. The other. And Patsy and G and their new baby occupied the cottage out back. I don't know who those are, but I'm not going all the way back through this book to find out. Elvis decided we needed more room. He wanted Sonny on call and close by. Discussions about a new home took on a new urgency. When a couple of old regulars, broke and jobless, showed up at our door, Elvis took pity on them and put them up in our living room. I awoke early in the morning to the sound of blaring music and found the two had passed out from drinking Jack Daniels and Coke. Half-empty glasses were strewn about the room and ashes littered the carpet. I felt my home was being turned into a boarding house. The part before that is interesting because it's about Lisa Marie. Although Elvis preferred to spoil Lisa, he did discipline her from time to time. Once he paddled her for writing all over a beautiful velvet couch with crayons. Then he immediately went into a panic, wanting me to assure him that he had done the right thing and that Lisa wouldn't hold it against him. Well, I mean, you can't promise that. When I told him that if you hadn't spanked her, I'd have, he felt better. The only other time he touched her in anger was after we'd repeatedly warned her not to go near the pool, and she did. She remembers this well and is proudly pleased by her 2 paddlings. I'm not a parent, but I say the second one definitely deserved and useful, preventing a child from harming itself. I don't know. The first one, I mean, it's crappy when kids ruin your upholstery, but children that age, I mean, how are they supposed to have any concept of what an expensive thing is? And like, it's, I mean, every parent has a kid that, like, you know, takes to the walls with their crayons or their markers, right? And they got to be disciplined somehow. Back in those days, I think it's pretty admirable that Priscilla and Elvis only paddled their daughter twice compared to their peers. Nobody asked you, Jay. Yes, I know. But the next part is also interesting because Priscilla points out that by the time Lisa's 4, she realized she could manipulate the help. And if any of them refused her anything she asked for, she threatened to tell her daddy and say, you're going to get fired. So none of them wanted her going to Elvis. So they let her get away with whatever she wanted. So Priscilla says the result was that Lisa had trouble learning what was right and wrong and what she could and couldn't do. If I could, I would now interview the late Michael Jackson and Nicolas Cage, who is still living, who had both married her, and ask what they think. And that's all that I would ask them about. And that's it for Priscilla Presley Bingo. For those of us who first became aware of who she was when she stole our heart in The Naked Gun with Leslie Nielsen, or was it Naked Gun 2? I forget. This has been an eye-opening experience, and I was told by somebody years ago that she gets nothing from the Elvis estate. She gets nothing. There was no in whatever the divorce settlement was. I'm sure I could look that up somewhere if I wanted to, but you know, she was doing stuff like The Naked Gun to make money as an entertainer. And I believe I did read that Lisa Marie got every single dime that was made from Graceland, like the gift shop and the souvenirs and Elvis merchandising after her father died. All that stuff went straight into a bank account for Lisa Marie. And that reminds me, there's some quotes from a guy named Jim Dickinson, who was with Sun Records back in the day. He said, well, I won't read the first paragraph here right now because it doesn't relate to what I'm trying to link this into. The second paragraph of this quote from Dickinson says, that's what's so so vulgar to me about Graceland now? Not the novelty shops and the tourist aspect of it, but the fact that the idea of Elvis is not there anymore. They've changed it so radically. It's all in real poor taste and it's real trashy redneck stuff. But it's no longer Elvis's poor taste. You know what I mean? It's not like the man wasn't a damn artist. Where is the art? They don't want you to see that because it's basically left of center. It will always be a mystery. The damn world changed, and as a child watching it happen, it didn't cross my mind that it was anything out of the ordinary until I left Memphis and went to Texas and realized just what I had seen. Now, the paragraph at the top of that, in contrast to what he was saying, relates to something I want to get into next. Dickinson says, people think Sam was foolish to sell Elvis's contract, meaning to RCA Records via the Colonel. But I disagree. I think Sam was recording an idea, and that idea was almost gone. And in fact, you could only see 2 or 3 little instances of it after Elvis left Sam, because Elvis was headed into pure pop music. And that's not what Sam was doing. Sam was recording an idea. And that validates Priscilla. Not that she needs validating from anybody else, but it's exactly the same sentiment you hear at the beginning of True Romance via the words written by Quentin Tarantino. You know, if you're not familiar, please go look it up. Just YouTube, True Romance, Elvis. There's something. Find it. It's very well put. Now let's talk about that transition from Sun Records to RCA Records with Elvis. Because for everyone that's like, hey, how come he was such a cool rockabilly badass, and then he ends up with like Do the Clam, you know? It didn't happen overnight. It happened over a long period of time, but the main catalyst to this change is exactly what Dickinson was talking about. It's moving away from this homegrown rockabilly edgy sound, for lack of a better word. I mean, it's very, very edgy. There's a reason why this shit scared people at the time. Not even just the racial overtones. That actual sound of the production of these records was pretty grating on the nerves of the establishment of nice white people that are used to, you know, every single song they like to listen to has like a professionally trained singer and a full orchestra behind them. Whether it's like schmaltzy and lighthearted like Lawrence Welk stuff, or it's incredibly emotional and you know, charged with feeling, it still is soft. It's still a lot of Vaseline on that lens, to use a visual metaphor that no one will get, or isn't terribly relevant anymore, at least.
Let's take a moment to consider the important, relevant lessons Teller and I have learned from the King of Kings. Elvis R.A.I.N.N. Presley died in 1977. He was born and lived at a time when most people in his land were literate. We have many first-hand reports about Elvis's life. We have many reliable records, medical, musical, and otherwise. Even so, there are people, lots of people, who insist Elvis is not really dead. Sound familiar? Even the dozens of books written by people who actually knew Elvis contain conflicting stories of his life. Sound familiar? There are people who insist Elvis didn't take drugs. Sound familiar? Yeah, that one doesn't to us either. We have photographs of Elvis in the morgue, dead as a fucking doornail, and in just 25 years, there are stories that he's not dead. In Fit for a King, an important work delving into the Elvis eating habits, the author suggests that in order to make Elvis's beloved fried chicken, you'll need 3/4 cup of flour, salt, paprika, and pepper. In Are You Hungry Tonight?, a definitive look into Elvis's favorite foods, the King's beloved fried chicken recipe calls for 1/2 cup of flour, salt, and pepper. Glaring differences. 1/4 cup less flour, no paprika? Fucking heretics. Now imagine trying to figure which is the true Elvis chicken 2,000 years from now. Elvis never did no drugs.
I love that bit. I think it makes a very nice point about religion if you want to get into it. If you don't want to get into it, I completely understand. But it makes a more important point about Elvis's food. And instead of me researching it, I just let Penn and Teller do the work for me. That was from Season 2, Episode 11 of Bullshit. Now, there's a ton more about Elvis's history and his life that I would have liked to have covered. There's a lot more live performance. There's a lot more studio recording time, but without the artist being responsible for their own music and lyrics, there's sort of less interest for me when it comes to that side of things. So much of Elvis's story is not, collaborating with musicians and coming up with just the perfect arrangement for a song or a take, or this, blinding inspiration coming from nowhere for a magical line that sets off an entire song that revolutionized music at the time. That kind of stuff doesn't happen. He's a performer, and he's the best for his time. So it's kind of similar to if I was just telling the life story of Tiny Tim, the singer and ukulele player, not the character from the Charles Dickens book. The one that Charles Dickens based his book on after he watched The Muppet Christmas Carol. That Tiny Tim. It's like talking about Liza Minnelli, that kind of a thing. So what I do want to touch on was something that I learned just towards the end of my research during this time. I reserve the right to do more Elvis episodes, just not about the John Carpenter film. Maybe I'll just do a review of Bubba Hotep with Bruce Campbell, because I haven't seen that since it was new in the theater. But there's an article that I've linked to in the description, originally published in June of 2013 and then updated in June of 2017, from the website practicalpainmanagement.com. If you go to the link, you'll see the name of the doctor in question, and you can also look him up on Amazon and purchase his books, one of which focuses solely on Elvis Presley. He had been sort of trying to unravel the mystery of Elvis's myriad medical problems and early death. For example, by his estimation, Elvis was quite well until approximately the last 10 years of his life. And then the last 3 years of his life, Elvis was so ill and disabled, he required around-the-clock nursing care. Now, the doctor's name is Forrest Tennant, MD, DRPH, head Arachnoiditis Research and Education Project. I don't know what that means, but I guess old Dr. Nick had to be put on trial and interrogated and questioned about the death of Elvis Presley to some degree, and this particular doctor who wrote the article and wrote the book stored all of his records, knowing that someday, eventually, maybe science would catch up to the mystery he was trying to solve. He says it's quite clear to him now, after piecing the evidence together, that Elvis's major disabling medical problems, and I would say, speaking as your narrator, I would say clearly his behavioral problems and his quick temper and his erratic behaviors that we'll get into, were definitely stemming from multiple head injuries that led to an autoimmune inflammatory disorder with subsequent central pain. His terminal event was cardiac arrhythmia, underpinned by drug abuse, genetic defects, and hastened along by an atrocious diet. The most underappreciated factor in the decline of Elvis Presley's health, he says, and early death was repeated head trauma. It is now recognized that multiple head trauma can cause autoimmune inflammatory disorder that can attack any organ in the body. Contemporary terms for pathologic developments that may occur following head trauma are post-concussion syndrome, TBI, and chronic traumatic encephalopathy. Pardon me. Some of the post-trauma symptoms include memory loss, obsessive-compulsive traits, and irrational or illogical behavior. Elvis demonstrated many of these obsessive-compulsive and erratic behaviors at different times. For example, he gave luxurious gifts to strangers, took spur-of-the-moment flights across the country, and waged an imaginary campaign against illegal drug dealers. On one occasion in 1970, he impulsively flew to Washington, D.C., and called on President Richard Nixon without prior appointment. He got a spur-of-the-moment facelift in 1975. His expenses soared to about $500,000 per month, and his entertainment group was essentially bankrupt just before his death due to his lavish, irrational expenditures. First documented instances of head trauma. In 1956, it is reported that Elvis pulled his Lincoln Continental into a Memphis gas station, asked the attendant to check his air conditioner. When passerby spotted him and surrounded him asking for his autograph, the attendant asked him to move. Elvis said, "Okay, man, just give me a minute." And he continued to sign autographs. This angered the attendant, who slapped Presley across the face. Elvis returned the punch, and another attendant joined into the fight. All three were eventually arrested on charges of assault and battery and disorderly conduct. Later the same year, Elvis and his musicians are at a long table in the Shalimar room of Toledo's Commodore Perry Hotel. A young construction worker apparently wanted to impress a girl he met at the bar, went over to Presley and said, "Are you Elvis Presley?" Elvis stood up and reached out his hand to shake, but instead of shaking his hand, the man clobbered Elvis across his face. He was momentarily stunned. Just before he entered the Army in 1958, he booked the Rainbow Roller Dome in Memphis for 7 nights in a row and gathered up a band of skaters to play endless self-invented war games. Elvis was downed at least once by a full body charge of a fellow skater. Games were rough enough that Elvis provided each skater with an oxycodone/aspirin, or took at least 4 of them at a time. The most serious head trauma occurred in Bel Air in 1967, just before he filmed Clambake. He tripped over a television cord in the bathroom and hit his head on the porcelain bathtub. He was knocked out cold and lay there for a time. I guess no one really knows. So it's impossible to tell, like, how much there might have been swelling in his brain for, untreated for a certain period of time. Who knows how long? You're not supposed to go to sleep if you have a concussion, because terrible things happen during that time. I'm not a doctor, but the next day he was clearly out of it and stated that he really did hurt himself really badly. He was described as despondent in his mood. On the way, when he was traveling, he would stop frequently at payphone, call a Memphis DJ, and request that he repeatedly play Tom Jones's Green Green Grass of Home. And then when they got to Graceland, he claimed to see his deceased mother standing in her old bedroom. Now, after all of this, his behavior got progressively more erratic and irrational. He refused to bathe around the time of 1975 and started developing sores on his body. He ordered unknown pills from Sweden, which supposedly would cleanse him from within, he said. 2 weeks of hospitalization in September of 79. He complained of 26 headaches, 14 bouts of insomnia, and general pain, hurting all over 4 or 5 times each nursing shift. Insomnia, headaches, and pain all over are typical of TBI victims. Patients with head trauma are now frequently enrolled in pain clinics. Their pain is clearly one of a central nature that has a fibromyalgia distribution, which patients describe as pain all over, just such as what he developed during the last few years of his life. Now, for his drug problem, what is not appreciated, says the doctor, is that he had at least 4 serious overdoses that caused coma and necessity of resuscitation before his death. If one survives an overdose, the big risk is residual brain damage caused by lack of oxygen. His drug abuse started with amphetamines when he was a teenager, and it escalated while in the Army. He was known to bribe German pharmacies for large quantities of amphetamines. After his discharge, he spent a period abusing alcohol. He did not drink regularly, but when he did, he drank excessively. When drinking, he had temper tantrums, got into fist fights with members of his entourage on at least 2 occasions. In his late 20s and 30s, he was drinking and accompanied this drink with an increasing use of amphetamines and sedatives. Let's see. This drug use accelerated after his fall in the bathroom in 1967. And at this point, he started adding opioids to the mix, along with everything else that he continued to take. Now, he could do this because, like a lot of addicts, he was very good at conning people out of drugs that supplied them. He had a bunch of physicians, dentists, and pharmacists on call in California, Nevada, and Tennessee who would supply him with prescriptions. Not to mention, like, spur of the moment or wherever he happened to be at the time, whatever hotel he happened to be in. He could certainly, being Elvis Presley, charm all kinds of other staff workers around him into getting him stuff. People didn't know what drug addicts were, generally, at that time. I mean, except for the fact that they were detestable by the general public. But they didn't know how to recognize these patterns in most people. All they knew were, someone that's like hopelessly strung out and miserable and, thieving. They don't know, nice, sexy, charming Elvis, asking them to send something up to the room maybe because they need a little bit extra medication that they might have ran out of, but they can't get a new prescription for because they're not back home in Tennessee or whatever. You know, people will do anything for this guy, obviously, as we've noted earlier. I guess Tom Parker had hoped that his marriage to Priscilla would sort of reduce that drug use, and for a short while, it did seem to. But his excessive drug use and erratic behavior were the main reasons that she left him in 1971. By 1973, Elvis is playing shows in Las Vegas a month at a time, and the physicians at the Las Vegas Hilton supplied him with unlimited quantities of dextroamphetamine, diazepam, ethinamate, hydromorphone, and meperidine. I don't know what most of those are. He also started injecting opioids at that time, and it's noted that dosage with injectable drugs is hard to control. On January 23rd, 73, Elvis suffered his first overdose from injectable hydromorphone. His live-in girlfriend found him comatose in bed and almost not breathing. Fortunately, the hotel doctor brought in oxygen, but this did nothing to curtail his use. His girlfriend, Linda Thompson, would report he took so many drugs he would fall asleep while chewing, and said she had clawed food from his windpipe 8 different times. His second drug overdose occurred June 28 in 1973, which required Dr. Nick to revive him with stimulants. Now, the article also notes that Dr. Nick would try all kinds of tricks to limit Elvis's drug use. He would find Elvis's drug stash at various places around the house, or at various hiding places while Elvis was on tour, and destroy what he found. He tried to prescribe the least harmful drugs he could while keeping Elvis functional. He would constantly substitute placebos as well. Dr. Nick and Priscilla and friends of Elvis's tried to get him to enter a chemical dependency treatment unit, and he always refused. The end result of all this, of course, is that at the time that he died, he was essentially non-functional and required constant nursing care. These, repeated instances of traumatic brain injury easily can be linked to reclusivity, obsessive-compulsive habits, paranoia, hostility, peculiar sex habits, poor hygiene, and more drug use. Also can cause hypothalamic pituitary dysfunction and trigger an autoimmune inflammatory process that may produce over time a multi-system disorder. Often, these patients can be misdiagnosed as having fibromyalgia. And in Elvis's case, you also, it turns out, had the added complication of all of these things on top of several genetic problems, including hypertension, megacolon, cytochrome defects, and antitrypsin deficiency. Don't know what those are. You can look them up. I'm not normally a do-your-own-research kind of guy, but in this case, that's what I'm doing. I'm bowing out. And I'd like to relate another story from Red West about taking some pills on a plane, or Elvis taking pills on a plane. He started getting very hyper very suddenly. This was on a private Jet Commander plane that Presley had bought 5 days before an engagement in Las Vegas. He was in the back of the plane and suddenly started yelling, "I can't breathe. Drop the oxygen mask. Drop the oxygen mask." Red recalls that his boss was gasping and that he and Charlie Hodge got very apprehensive. The oxygen mask didn't seem to do Presley any good. His breathing was badly messed up, says Red. About the time I noticed, an air vent on the floor, and there was a lot of air coming out. Well, I told Elvis to lie down on the floor, put his face over the air vent where the air was whooshing through. Then Red and Charlie heard words from Presley that shot through them with fear. "I'm not going to make it," he gasped. "Land." An emergency landing was made in Dallas, and Presley and Red and Charlie went to a motel for 5 hours while the pilot changed planes. He was okay soon after that, says Red. The effects of the pill had worn off. Sonny and Red say that they had seen Presley wiped out on the painkiller Demerol, complete with head nodding and slack jaw. They recall that on one such jag, it was suggested that someone take a photograph of him so that he could see what he looked like at all those times. All of them agree that if not for the eagle eye of Dr. George Nikopoulos. Presley may have had a lot more trouble with drugs. Both Red and Sonny say that Dr. Nick, like Joe Esposito, would often take capsules and drugs that Presley had smuggled in and replace them with vitamins. Dr. Sidney Boyer, who treated him for his throat problems, and Dr. Ganham were not as close to Presley and probably knew nothing of his abuses. Red, Sonny, and Dave have all seen Presley in a complete stupor from his pill taking. There have been, says Sonny, actual shows that he has done that he can't remember. The audience must know something is going on. Sometimes he gets up there and talks to the audience instead of singing. He will give his philosophies on life, and it's very boring. People go there to see the old Elvis magic. One night, he did a damn karate exhibition for 28 minutes straight in Las Vegas. People were walking out all over the place. I never saw a word in the press about it. He lives a charmed life. Sometimes he will forget the sequences of songs, and he will forget the lyrics to songs. Other times, there are songs scheduled to be sung, and he will just refuse to do them. On the other hand, says Dave Hebler, when he is straight and he is slimmed down and he is just going on his own energy, there is no showman like him on earth. He is a born performer. I think that's fair, and that's a fair place to stop. Yeah, I've enjoyed this. I've enjoyed digging deep into the Elvis lore, comparing what is sort of on the record and understood with what was delivered to the public at the time. Who knows how much of it is, legit when it comes to the stories of people that he employed. But it all tracks. It all seems fairly consistent. I know there's a lot more scandalous stuff that other people wrote about his sex habits and stuff. People can check that out for themselves. There's so much scandalous stuff that it would be, I think, irresponsible and unbalanced for me to dig into too much more of it, because then I haven't, done enough on the music side of it or the, other elements of his life and career. Is he the king of rock and roll? I'm tempted to say yes. I'm tempted to rule that out of the five that I always name, Jerry Lee Lewis, Little Richard, Lemmy, Chuck Berry, and Elvis Presley, if I did have to pick one, I think there's enough of a case there for Elvis being apart from that crowd. He's not as important to me, personally. I think Chuck Berry's the man that rises above all others in terms of importance and visceral effect, especially on myself when it comes to that guitar playing and the compositions and the stage presentation. Elvis, though, was the fall guy for rock and roll during his time. He's the one that got most of the heat, and he's the one that got the most famous and didn't write a single song of his own. He was a being. And he moved on to non-rock and roll stuff, just as Jerry Lee did, and just as Little Richard did, just as Chuck Berry did, in their own times. Lemmy, not so much. So I think it's either Lemmy or it's Elvis. It's my show. It's all bullshit anyway. Just crowning someone the king of rock and roll. It's all subjective. It doesn't really matter. You could tell me, you could make a perfectly good case to me that the second director of photography on the set of the third season of Cheers was the king of rock and roll. I don't know. I do know rock and roll is the best. And so are you. Please support by telling a friend about this if you liked it. I'd really, really appreciate it. And if you'd like to reach out on Twitter, it's @RockFilmRock. On Instagram, @JustTheWorstEver. And Gmail, @JustTheWorstEver. There's a link in the description to what is right now my link tree for other kinds of support. At this time, we have no patrons. We have no advertisements. So I'm just going off of my own steam on days that I'm not working a dumb day job. I really appreciate you being here for it, though. And because of that, I want you to know that you absolutely deserve to have a happy life, good people around you, and to be treated well. Be nice to yourself if you can, and if only for a little while. Farewell for now.